Margaret Dawson's hands were shaking so badly she could barely close her fingers around the egg. 4 days without food, 4 days running. She didn't think about what she was doing, she just reached into that stranger's chicken coop and took what her body was screaming for. That was the moment she heard it. The unmistakable metallic click of a Winchester being cocked. She froze, turned slowly, and found herself looking way up at the largest, most terrifying man she had ever seen in her life. If a story about a woman who had nothing left finding the one person who saw everything she was worth speaks to your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The egg broke. Margaret felt the warm yolk run between her fingers, and she almost cried, not from embarrassment, not from being caught, but because it was gone. That one small thing she had managed to reach, managed to take, managed to hold for exactly 3 seconds before her trembling hands betrayed her, was gone. She stood there in the dimming evening light with broken shell on her palm and egg running down her wrist, and she thought, this is what you've been reduced to, Margaret Ann Dawson. This is what's left of you. She had been a baker's daughter once. Her father's shop on the main street of Billings had smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke every morning of her life. People had known her name. People had smiled when she walked in with a tray of fresh rolls still steaming from the oven. She had worn clean dresses and kept her dark hair neat, and she had believed the way young women believe things before life shows them otherwise, that if you worked hard and kept your word and treated people decently, the world would return the favor. The world had not returned the favor. Her father had borrowed money 14 months ago. A small loan he'd told her just to keep the ovens running through a bad winter. He'd borrowed it from a man named Silas Calloway, who ran the gaming house on the east end of Billings, and who smiled the way a snake would smile if a snake had learned how. Her father had paid it back. Margaret knew this because she had kept his ledgers. She had seen every entry. The debt had been settled in full by the following spring. But Gerald Dawson had died in August, a fever that came fast and left no room for goodbyes. And the morning after they put him in the ground, Silas Calloway had appeared at the door of the bakery with 2 men behind him and a piece of paper in his hand. "Your father's debt," he'd said pleasantly, like he was discussing the weather. "Still outstanding. Now transfers to you." That debt was paid, Margaret had said. She remembered keeping her voice steady. She was proud of that later. "I have the records." Calloway had smiled. "I have different records, Miss Dawson, and mine carry a judge's signature." The records he produced were forgeries. She knew it the moment she saw them. The handwriting was close, but not quite her father's. The slope of the letters too uniform, too careful, like someone who had practiced but not lived with a pen. But the judge's signature was real enough, and the 2 men behind Calloway had the look of men who had hurt people before and found it agreeable work. "There's another way to settle it," Calloway had said, then still smiling, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You're a capable woman, good with your hands in a kitchen. I could use someone like that, among other things." She had understood exactly what he meant. She had told him exactly where he could go. She'd been running ever since. That had been 4 days ago. She had taken the back roads out of Billings with nothing but the dress on her back, her late mother's silver thimble in her pocket, and her father's original financial ledgers sewn into the hem of her worn brown skirt. The real ones. The ones with her father's genuine handwriting. Every entry accounted for every payment noted in his careful hand. She hadn't known what else to take. She hadn't had time to think. The first day she'd walked until her feet bled through her shoes. The second day, she'd found a creek and followed it north into the mountains, because the mountains were the only direction Calloway's men hadn't been when she'd last seen them. The third day, she'd eaten wild berries off a bush she'd prayed weren't poisonous, and walked on. By the 4th day, she'd stopped feeling hunger as something sharp and urgent. It had become something heavy instead, a thick, pressing weight that made everything slow. Her thoughts, her steps, her ability to reason clearly about things like property and trespassing and the consequences of stealing from strangers. She'd smelled the ranch before she'd seen it. Wood smoke, hay, and something else, the faint, unmistakable warmth of animals kept close of a working place lived in by someone who cared for it. She'd followed that smell the way a drowning woman follows a rope, not asking questions, not thinking ahead, just moving toward it, because her body had made the decision before her mind could interfere. The chicken coop had been right there, unlocked. 3 beautiful brown eggs sitting in the straw like they'd been left for her specifically, like God had placed them there and said, "Here, Margaret, you've had enough." She had reached for the nearest one, managed to wrap her fingers around it, felt the smooth warmth of it against her palm, and then her hands had shaken, and it had slipped, and it had broken, and the yolk was running between her fingers, and she was standing there in someone else's chicken coop with theft on her hands in the most literal possible sense when she heard the Winchester. Click. She turned slowly. Her mind had gone very quiet the way it goes quiet sometimes when something too large to process arrives all at once. She registered a man. Tall was not the right word for him. He was built the way the mountains around her were built, as though the land itself had decided to stand upright and take a human shape. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the peaks above them, and eyes the deep still color of a mountain lake just before a storm. He was holding the Winchester with the ease of a man who had been holding rifles since before she was born, and it was pointed not quite at her, she noticed, but close enough that the distinction felt academic. She waited for him to speak. He didn't. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I'll pay you back. I don't have anything right now, but I will. I'm not a thief. I want you to know that. I don't do this." He still didn't speak. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand, not with cruelty, not with judgment, just a slow, careful assessment that took in her sunburned face and her swollen feet, and her dress that had been worn brown 3 days ago and was now the color of the mountain trail, and the dried tear tracks on her cheeks that she hadn't even known were there until she felt his gaze trace them. "I'll replace the egg," she said. "I'll work for it. Whatever you need. I can cook, I can clean, I'm good with gardens, I know how to—" She stopped. Her voice had started shaking, and she would not let it break. She pressed her lips together and stared at a point just past his left shoulder and breathed carefully through her nose. "Please don't shoot me," she said quietly to that point past his shoulder. "I'm not ready to die. I don't think I've done anything bad enough yet to deserve it." There was a long pause. Then she heard the sound of the rifle being uncocked. "Come inside," the man said. His voice was low. Not gentle exactly. Gentleness was a soft word, and there was nothing soft about this man's voice but level, without threat. The voice of someone who had made a decision and saw no need to debate it. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon. Supper's almost ready." He turned and walked toward the cabin without looking back to see if she followed. "You look like you haven't eaten in 3 days." "4," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't turn around, but she saw just barely the set of his shoulders shift something that wasn't quite a flinch, wasn't quite a wince, but was something. She followed him inside. His name was Nathaniel Granger, though he said it the way a man says something he's almost forgotten. Matters plainly without ceremony. Setting a bowl of stew on the table in front of her, and sitting down across from her with his own, and waiting for her to eat before he touched his. She noticed that. It registered somewhere beneath the consuming business of tasting the first hot food she'd had in 4 days, and trying not to weep from the sheer relief of it. "Margaret Dawson," she said when she could speak again. "From Billings." "Long way from Billings." Yes, he didn't ask why. She told him anyway because the food had brought her back to herself enough to be afraid again. And being afraid made her talk. She told him about her father and the bakery, and the loan and Calloway, and the forged documents, and the 2 men with their flat eyes who followed Calloway like shadows with appetites. She told him about running. She told him about the mountains. She did not tell him about what she'd sewn into the hem of her dress, because she didn't know yet whether he was the kind of man she could trust with that. He listened. He ate his stew. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't look at her with pity, which she had braced herself for and would have found unbearable. He looked at her with attention, as though what she was saying was information he intended to take seriously. When she finished, the fire had burned lower, and the cabin had gotten darker, and she realized with a start that outside the one small window, the sky had gone from orange to deep purple to the particular blue-black that comes right before stars. She had been talking for a long time. "I should go," she said. "I shouldn't have. I'll go. I'm sorry for the egg. I'll find a way to—" "Where?" he said. She stopped. "What? Where are you going to go?" It wasn't a question. It was a flat statement of the actual facts of her situation delivered without cruelty, but without any softening either. She had no answer. She sat there with her hands wrapped around the empty bowl, and no answer. Nate Granger pushed back from the table. He stood that great unhurried height of him, filling the low-ceilinged cabin, and he walked to the fireplace and put another log on and stood looking at it for a moment, with his hands on the mantel. Then he turned around. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. There's a land company out of Helena, BlackRock Capital. They've been buying up mountain claims for the last 2 years, some legal, most not. They've got a federal survey coming through the territory in 6 weeks. He paused. Any claim that can't prove continuous family homestead use by that survey date gets classified as open range and goes to auction. Margaret frowned. "This is your land. You've been here." "I've been here 11 years, he said. "Alone. A man living alone on a mountain claim isn't a homestead under the new federal definition. They changed the language 8 months ago. A homestead requires—" He stopped. His jaw worked once like he was chewing on the words and finding them difficult. "A family unit," he said finally. "Husband and wife, or documented evidence of same." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You don't have a wife?" "No." "And you don't have family nearby who could—" "No." She looked at him. He was still standing by the fireplace, his hands at his sides now, and he was looking back at her with those dark stormwater eyes. And she understood with a slowness that was partly exhaustion and partly the sheer improbability of what was happening, what he was about to say before he said it. "I know this is not a reasonable thing to ask," Nate said. His voice was the same as it had been all evening, level, careful, like a man measuring out something valuable by hand. "I know we met 45 minutes ago, and you have no cause to trust me and considerable cause to be afraid of every man you've encountered in the last week. I know all of that. But," she said, "but I have a ranch I've spent 11 years building. And 6 weeks before a federal survey, that'll take half of it if I can't prove a family claim." He held her gaze. "You have a gambling boss who will drag you back to Billings the moment you set foot on a main road anywhere in the territory, and nowhere to go." "That's the situation," Margaret said carefully. "That's the situation." He nodded. "So I'm going to give you a choice, Miss Dawson, and I want you to know that either answer is acceptable to me, and neither one will put you back outside in the dark tonight." She waited. "You can stay here," he said, "as a ranch hand, until you've worked off the egg and we figure out what comes next." He paused. Or, another pause longer, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that was almost uncertainty. "You can wear white beside me, before the end of the week, and we can both stop running." The fire crackled. Outside, a nightbird called once and went silent. Margaret Dawson sat at a stranger's table in a stranger's cabin on a mountain she'd stumbled onto by accident, with egg on her hands and worn-out shoes, and a fortune in stolen documents sewn into her hem, and she looked at Nathaniel Granger and tried to find the trick in it. She couldn't find one. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why would you offer that? To someone you just met, someone who was stealing from you an hour ago?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because you looked at me like you expected me to shoot you, and you held your ground anyway." He reached over and picked up her bowl and carried it to the basin without looking at her. A person who's used to being treated badly learns to expect it. Doesn't mean they deserve it. Margaret pressed her lips together hard. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "That's fair. And I'll need to know if I said yes what exactly you'd expect, what the arrangement would be." He turned from the basin and looked at her directly. "Honesty," he said. "Loyalty. A fair day's work, same as I'd give you." He paused. "Nothing else unless you wanted it. And not a word from me on that subject until you decided one way or the other." She had heard men make promises before. She had heard Silas Calloway make very convincing promises about her father's debt being a small thing, a manageable thing, a thing that would never come between neighbors. She had learned to listen not to the words, but to the steadiness behind them. Whether a man's voice wobbled when he was asking for something, whether his eyes moved to check if you believed him. Nate Granger's eyes didn't move. His voice didn't wobble. He was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her all evening, like she was a real person. A person whose answer mattered, a person whose judgment about her own life was worth something. "I'd like to sleep on it," she said. "Guest room's the door on the left," he said, and went back to doing the dishes. She lay awake for a long time in the narrow bed in the left-hand room with the clean wool blanket pulled up and the sound of the mountain wind against the window and her father's voice in her head, not speaking any particular words, just present the way he'd always been present, steady and careful and honest. She thought about what she'd told herself when she ran, that she would find a way, that she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did not let men like Calloway decide what her life was worth. She thought about Nate Granger standing at the fireplace with his hands on the mantel, making a proposal so plain-spoken and so strange that she hadn't once in an hour of turning it over been able to find the part where he was lying. She thought about the ledgers sewn into her hem, the evidence that could bring Calloway down if she could ever get it to someone honest enough to care. She'd been alone with that for 4 days, and it had been the loneliest weight she'd ever carried. She thought about a man who looked at a starving woman stealing eggs from his coop and saw not a criminal, not an embarrassment, not an opportunity, but a person who was holding her ground even when she expected to be shot. She made her decision sometime around midnight. When she came out of the guest room the next morning at first light, Nate was already at the table with 2 cups of coffee. He looked up, said nothing, waited. "2 conditions," Margaret said. "Name them." "First, the moment we can get word to someone who can verify those land company documents are as fraudulent as I think they are, we take that step. I won't let you fight a legal battle with one hand tied behind your back." He nodded slowly. "And the second?" She looked at him straight on, the way her father had taught her to look at people when she meant what she was saying. "You never make me feel like I owe you this. Not once. Not ever." Something moved in Nathaniel Granger's face then. It was brief, a flicker across those weathered features, and she would spend a long time afterward trying to name it. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like recognition. Like a man hearing something said aloud that he'd already believed privately for a very long time. "Miss Dawson," he said quietly, "you don't owe me a single thing." He pushed the second cup of coffee toward her. She sat down. And that was how it began. Not with romance, not with promises, not with anything warmer than 2 people in difficult circumstances making a practical agreement over coffee at first light. But Margaret Dawson, who had come off 4 days of the mountain with nothing left and no direction to turn, sat across from Nathaniel Granger in his small kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt since before her father got sick. She felt like she was somewhere she was allowed to be. The town of Silver Ridge was 7 miles down the mountain, a frontier scattering of buildings that had the appearance of permanence and the actual stability of anything built quickly and cheaply on hope. They rode down that morning on Nate's 2 horses, Margaret on a steady brown mare named Ada, who seemed to have opinions about trail conditions and expressed them without reservation, which Margaret found entirely reasonable, and she noticed how the mountain changed around him as they descended. On his land, Nate moved with the ease of a man who knew every stone and hollow by name. The moment the trail left his property line, she saw him straighten in the saddle, and his eyes began moving the way they moved when he was taking account of things. "People know you here," she said. "Most of them." "What do they know?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I'm not a man who bothers people," he said, "and that when I say something I mean it." That turned out to be, she would discover, something of an understatement. The reaction in Silver Ridge to Nathaniel Granger walking into the registrar's office with a woman at his side was difficult to categorize. The man behind the counter, a Mr. Holt, according to the sign on his desk, looked up from his papers, and then looked again, and then stood up, which seemed to be an involuntary response. "Granger," he said. "Holt, I need a marriage license." Silence. Then, "This morning, before noon if possible." More silence. Holt's eyes moved to Margaret with an expression she recognized, the slow appraisal that starts at the face and moves downward with a kind of arithmetical quality, adding and subtracting. She had lived with that expression her whole life. She stood still and let it land and made sure her own face gave him nothing useful in return. "This the woman," Holt said. "She's standing right here," Nate said. His voice didn't change in any way Margaret could measure precisely. But Holt seemed to feel something in it, because his eyes returned quickly to Nate's face and stayed there. "Yes, sir," Holt said, and reached for his paperwork. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldrich, who smelled like tobacco and last night's whiskey, and who performed the ceremony in his back office with the speed of a man who had somewhere else to be. Margaret stood in her worn brown dress, she had no other, and Nate stood in the same clothes he'd worn to breakfast, and Aldrich read the words from the book in the flat, rapid tone of something recited so many times it had lost its shape entirely. When Aldrich said, "You may now," and glanced at Nate with a small knowing smirk, Nate looked at Margaret instead with a question in his eyes, a genuine question asking permission, and she gave him the smallest nod, and he took her hand and shook it, formally, like they'd concluded a fair negotiation, which she supposed they had. Aldrich looked at the handshake. Something crossed his face that might have been confusion or might have been disappointment. He signed the paper and handed it over and went back to his other business. On the ride back up the mountain, the license folded in Nate's coat pocket. They were quiet for a long while. The morning was clear, and the mountain air had that sharp, clean quality that made you feel like you could see all the way to next week. "Are you frightened?" Nate asked, not looking at her, watching the trail. "I've been frightened for 4 days," Margaret said. "I'm not sure I can tell the difference anymore between frightened and just awake." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "Are you?" she asked. He seemed to consider this seriously. "I'm cautious," he said finally. "Of what? Of not holding up my end of this." He paused. "I've been alone a long time, Miss Dawson. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to read weather and track game and build fence and fix most things that break. I don't know—" He stopped. "You don't know what," she said. "I don't know how to make someone feel at home," he said. "I've only ever done it for myself." Margaret looked at him, at the straight line of his back, and the careful way he held his reins, and the slight tightness at the corner of his jaw that said this admission had cost him something. "Well," she said, "I've been making places feel like home my whole life, so perhaps that part can be mine." He looked over at her, brief, direct. "That seems fair," he said. And they rode the rest of the way up in a silence that had changed just slightly into something with less distance in it. The first morning she woke up on the ranch, as Margaret Granger, the name sat oddly like a shoe not yet broken in, she lay in the guest room for exactly 3 minutes before she got up. There was bread to be made. She could tell from the state of the kitchen the previous evening that Nate had been living on jerked meat and whatever he could cook in one pot, which wasn't a criticism, simply an observation about what a kitchen could become without someone who treated it as a place to build something, rather than a place to merely survive. She found flour and salt, and the good cast-iron pan and a crock of lard, and she made biscuits. She found dried beans and a ham bone, and she started them soaking for soup. She found 3 crocks of preserves in the cellar that she thought were probably a year old, and brought them up to check, and they were fine, put up well. Somebody's careful hands behind them, though she didn't know whose. And she set them on the table where they'd be easy to reach. Nate came in from his morning chores at sunrise and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, You didn't have to do that. I was awake, she said, and I wanted to. She handed him a biscuit wrapped in a cloth napkin. They're better hot. He took it, looked at her. Thank you, he said with the serious deliberateness of a man who meant every syllable of it. Don't thank me for biscuits, Mr. Granger, she said, turning back to the stove. That's a very low bar. She heard something then behind her from the direction of the doorway. She turned around. He was looking at the biscuit in his hand, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and not quite not a smile. Nate, he said. I beg your pardon? My name, he said. Nate, if we're going to... He paused. If this is going to be a real thing, you should probably use it. All right, she said. Nate. She turned back to the stove. Eat your biscuit before it gets cold. Yes, ma'am, said Nathaniel Granger. And outside the mountain, morning opened up wide and clear, and full of things that hadn't happened yet. She burned the first batch of preserves she tried to put up on Nate's stove, not because she didn't know what she was doing. Margaret Dawson had been putting up preserves since she was 7 years old, standing on a step stool beside her mother, but because Nate's stove ran hot on the left side, and nobody had told her, and she hadn't yet learned to read it the way you learn to read any living thing through attention paid over time. The smell hit her before the sound did that particular bitter-sweet scorch that means you've gone past the point of saving it, and she pulled the pot off with a dish rag and stood there looking at the ruined blackberries and felt for one brief and humiliating moment like crying. She didn't cry. She dumped the pot, washed it, started over, and moved everything to the right side of the stove. Nate came in from the east fence line sometime around mid-morning and found her at the stove with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of blackberry juice across her forearm, and a look on her face that dared anyone to comment. He looked at the pot, looked at the stain on the dish rag she'd hung over the basin. Said nothing. The left side runs hot, he said, pouring himself water from the pitcher. I noticed, she said. Should have told you. Yes, she agreed pleasantly. You should have. He set the cup down. I'll remember. See that you do. She stirred the pot without looking at him. There's cornbread in the pan on the right side. Don't touch the left. She heard him move to the pan. Heard the small sound of approval. He made not a word. Just a breath through the nose. The kind of sound a man makes when something exceeds his expectation, and he doesn't quite know what to do with that. And then the scrape of the stool as he sat at the table. Margaret, he said. How did you learn all of it? She looked over her shoulder. All of what? He gestured at the kitchen in a general way that encompassed she understood everything. The cooling cornbread, the preserves in progress, the herbs she'd hung upside down from the ceiling beam the previous afternoon, the butter she'd set in the cold box with the correct cloth over it. All of this. My mother first, she said. Then my father. He said a baker who doesn't understand the whole kitchen only understands half the job. She turned back to the stove. He was right about most things. He sounds like he was a good man. She kept her eyes on the pot. He was the best man I ever knew, she said. Until recently, my only competition was Silas Calloway, so the bar wasn't hard to clear. Nate was quiet a moment. Then, I meant until recently the best man you'd known was your father. She stirred. I know what you meant. Another silence. She heard him tear off a piece of cornbread. That's a generous thing to say, he said quietly, considering we've been married about 36 hours. I said what I said, Nate. Don't make it into more than it is. I'm not making it into anything, he said. I'm just... A pause. The sound of him setting the cornbread down. I'm not accustomed to someone saying a kind thing and meaning it simply. No conditions behind it. Margaret turned from the stove and looked at him directly. He was sitting at the table with the cornbread in his hand, and he was looking at the table, not at her, and there was something in the line of his jaw that she recognized, not from knowing him. They were 36 hours past the beginning of knowing each other, but from knowing people. It was the look of a man who had been alone long enough that simple human warmth had become something he didn't know how to hold without suspicion. "Nate," she said. He looked up. "The cornbread is good because you had good cornmeal, and I know what to do with it. That's all it is. Don't go looking for a trick in it." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face settled almost imperceptibly, like a door that had been braced against the wind, easing just slightly off the frame. "All right," he said. "Good." She turned back to the stove. "Now eat it before it gets cold. I already ruined one batch of blackberries this morning, and I don't need another failure on my record." This time she was almost certain she heard him laugh. It was brief, barely a sound at all, more like something that escaped before he could stop it. But it was there, and it landed in the kitchen like a change in weather. She decided not to comment on it. She filed it away instead, in the quiet part of herself that had started paying careful attention to Nathaniel Granger, without entirely meaning to. The days that followed had a rhythm to them, that Margaret found to her own surprise, not merely tolerable, but deeply satisfying, in a way she hadn't expected to feel in a place that wasn't hers by any ordinary measure. She rose before dawn, made coffee, had it on the table when Nate came in from checking the animals, which he did every morning at first light, without fail, in the same order: horses, cattle, chickens, the 2 dogs who lived mostly in the barn, but occasionally condescended to supervise operations from the porch. She learned the order within the first week, because she was a woman who paid attention, and by the end of the second week, she had it timed well enough that the coffee was always exactly drinkable temperature when he walked in, never scalding, never cooled. He noticed. He didn't say so directly, but she could tell by the way he wrapped his hands around the cup with a particular deliberateness, the same way a man handles something he knows is valuable and doesn't want to drop. She organized the supply cellar by category and frequency of use, and then repaired the latch on its door that had been sticking badly enough that getting it open required a specific combination of lift and pull that probably only Nate knew. She fixed it with a piece of wire and 30 minutes of patience, and afterward, it opened smoothly, and the next morning she heard Nate go down to the cellar, and then come back up and stand in the kitchen, in what she understood from the texture of the silence to be mild astonishment. "Cellar door," he said. "Latches now," she confirmed, not looking up from her biscuit dough. "You fixed it." "It wasn't complicated. It just needed someone to bother." "I've been meaning to bother for 8 months," he said. "Well," she said, folding the dough, "now you don't have to." She repaired the tear in the left knee of his work trousers that he'd apparently been ignoring for so long it had frayed into something that was technically no longer a repair situation, but was actually a reconstruction project. And she did it so well that when she put them on the chair outside his bedroom door, and he came out the next morning, he looked at the knee for a long moment, and then looked at her, and she could tell he was working out whether to say something, and she saved him the trouble. "I had good thread," she said. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No, but your knee was showing through, and it's cold up here at night, and I had the thread and the time." He looked at her the way he was beginning to look at her more and more, that direct, assessing, somewhat baffled gaze of a man who keeps encountering something he doesn't have a proper category for. "Margaret," he said. "Nate." "Thank you." "You're welcome. The biscuits are on the right side of the stove." He took his trousers and his biscuit and went back to work, and Margaret put her needle away and allowed herself privately to feel pleased. What she hadn't expected, the thing that caught her genuinely off guard, was watching him with the animals. She'd seen how he was with Ada, her mare, calm, consistent, never sharp, but she'd attributed that to general competence. Then one morning she went to the barn to collect eggs, and found him crouched down beside the smallest of the barn cats, a skinny gray thing that was clearly new to the property, and clearly terrified, and he was talking to it. Not making sounds at it, talking to it in a low, even voice, giving it a full account of his intentions regarding its presence on the ranch, and what the other animals were like, and what it could expect from the weather in the coming weeks. The cat was listening. Its ears were forward, and its body had stopped its desperate pressing against the wall, and it was listening to Nathaniel Granger describe the Montana winter with the focused attention of someone receiving useful information. Margaret stood in his barn doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then she went and got the eggs and left, and didn't mention what she'd seen. But she thought about it for most of the day. She thought about a man who explained himself to a frightened cat, who gave a terrified animal the information it needed to feel safe, not because it would understand every word, but because the patience and steadiness of the voice was itself the message. You are safe here. I will not hurt you. This is what to expect. She thought about herself in the chicken coop 4 days into starvation, expecting to be shot, and a man who had lowered his rifle and said, "Come inside," in exactly that same voice. She was not a cat. She understood words. But the principle, she thought, was not so different. She was pulling weeds from the vegetable garden that afternoon. It had been badly neglected, the kind of neglect that happens when a competent man simply has too many tasks, and the garden keeps losing to more urgent demands when she heard horses on the trail below. More than one, coming up fast. She stood and looked toward the tree line. 3 riders. Men she didn't recognize, but men she recognized, the kind of men who ride with a particular ease that comes from having other men's fear for a road. They pulled up at the edge of the property just past the fence line, and the one in front, heavy-set, wearing a town coat that was wrong for the mountain, looked at her with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes he has already won whatever conversation is about to happen. "Looking for a man named Granger," he said. "He's on the property," Margaret said. She kept her voice level. Her heart had gone from normal to hammering in approximately 1 second, but she had learned in the last several months that fear was most useful when it stayed internal. "I can pass on a message. You as woman." She looked at him. "I'm his wife." Something moved in the man's expression. Surprise quickly replaced by a recalculation of some kind. "That's new," he said. "Most things are at first," she said. "What's your business with my husband?" "That's between us and him," the man said. But he was looking at her with a new quality of attention, and not the kind she appreciated. "Legal matter. You can tell him that. Granger and BlackRock Capital got some paperwork to sort through." BlackRock Capital. The land company. Nate had said they'd be coming. She'd believed him. But hearing the name said aloud by a man on a horse at the edge of their property made it real in a way that settled differently in her chest. "I'll tell him," she said. "You do that." The man in the town coat looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, the assessing, tallying kind of look she'd spent her whole life receiving from men who thought their judgment of her appearance was information she needed. Then he turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back down the trail. Margaret stood in the garden until they were out of sight. Then she set down her weeding tool, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to find Nate. She found him at the east fence as she expected. He listened to what she told him without interrupting, his hands still on the fence post he'd been working on. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Pierce," he said. "That's who they'd send. Big man, town coat." "Yes." "He comes for BlackRock." Nate straightened. "It means they've started the formal process. They'll file first, then try to claim the survey result before we can contest it." "How long do we have?" "Before the survey, 5 weeks now." He looked at the fence line. Not at her, at the fence, at the land beyond it, at something that existed in the middle distance where plans are made. "Pierce coming here means they know about the marriage." "How?" "Small town," he said. "Aldrich wouldn't have gone out of his way to tell anyone. But Holt at the registrar talks." Margaret thought about Holt and his arithmetic eyes. What does it mean that they know? It means they'll try to prove the marriage isn't legitimate. He turned to look at her then, and his face was steady, but she could see behind the steadiness something working. Not panic, nothing close to panic, but the particular focus of a man who has just had his timeline revised. "They'll dig into it. Ask questions in town. Look for anyone who'll say it was arranged for the property." "It was arranged for the property?" Margaret said. "Yes," he said, "but it's legal, and it's real." He held her gaze. "Unless you've changed your mind about that." She looked back at him. The late afternoon light was doing something particular to the mountain around them, the way it does in the hours before evening, when everything turns gold and sharp-edged. And Nathaniel Granger stood there, in the middle of it, looking at her with those careful, serious eyes, waiting for her answer, with the patience of a man who had decided her answer would be whatever it was going to be, and he would deal with it accordingly. "I haven't changed my mind," she said. Something in him settled. "Then we stand on the ground we've got," he said, "and we make it hold." He went back to the fence post. She went back to the garden. Neither of them said anything else about it for the rest of the evening, but the shape of the air between them was different, denser somehow, with the weight of something shared that hadn't existed between them that morning. The next 3 weeks moved the way time moves when you are both very busy and very watchful, fast in the body and slow in the mind. Margaret expanded the vegetable garden by a third and planted the late-season varieties she'd found in a seed tin in the cellar that had been waiting apparently for someone to remember they existed. She reorganized Nate's supply inventory and found that he'd been overbuying certain items and running short on others in a pattern so consistent it was clearly systematic and easily fixed. She fixed it. She made bread twice a week and kept the kitchen running at a level of efficiency that she was privately rather proud of. And she did it not because she felt she owed Nate the domestic labor she had made him promise she wouldn't feel that way, and she held him to it, but because the kitchen was where she thought, and she needed something to do with her hands while she was thinking. She was thinking most of those 3 weeks about the ledgers. She had told Nate about them in that first night's supper, that she had documents that they proved her father's debt had been fabricated, but she hadn't yet told him where they were or exactly what they contained. Not because she didn't trust him. She had come in 3 weeks of close quarters and careful observation to trust Nathaniel Granger with a completeness that surprised her, given the speed of it. But the ledgers were the only solid thing she had. They were her father's voice, his handwriting, his careful record of every transaction he'd ever made, and she'd been carrying them against her skin for so long that parting with them, even to show them, even to put them in someone else's hands for any length of time, felt like an amputation. She was ready finally the night he came in from a long day of checking the upper range with mud on his boots and dried sweat at his collar, and a look on his face that said he'd found something he wasn't expecting, and it wasn't good. "What is it?" she said before he'd even taken his coat off. He sat down at the table. That alone told her something he usually went and washed up before sitting, a point of personal discipline she'd noticed early and found quietly admirable. He sat down with his coat still on and put his hands flat on the table. "There's a new marker on the north corner of the upper range," he said. "Black Rock survey post. They jumped the timeline by 2 weeks." The room went quiet, in the specific way it goes quiet when news arrives that changes the shape of everything. "They can't do that," Margaret said. "They did it," he said. "Which means they think they can, or they have someone in the federal office who'll let it stand." He looked at his hands. "If that marker holds, they can begin filing before we get our documentation submitted. At that point, it becomes a legal contest that costs more to fight than the land is worth, which is the point." She sat down across from him. "Nate, if I lose the upper range, I lose the water rights that go with it. Without the water, the lower ranch isn't viable for cattle. I can survive it, but the operation—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I have something," she said. He looked up. She stood turned away from him and began working at the hem of her brown dress. She heard him start to say something, a question or a protest. She couldn't tell which, and she said, "Give me a moment." And he went quiet. She got the stitching open at the inside hem and worked the oilskin packet loose, the one she'd sewn there the morning she ran from Billings, the one she'd checked every night before she slept to make sure it was still there. She turned around and put it on the table between them. He looked at the packet. "What is this?" "My father's ledgers," she said. "The real ones. Every transaction Gerald Dawson ever made in his own hand, including the loan from Callaway, the date he took it, the terms he agreed to, and—" she pointed to the tied edge of the packet, "the date he paid it back, with the receipt he got from Callaway's own cashier, which Callaway apparently forgot my father had kept." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that happens when a room adjusts to the arrival of something that changes the calculation. Nate looked at the packet. He looked at her. "You've been carrying this since Billings." "Since the morning after my father was buried," she said. "I sewed it in the night before I ran. This proves the debt was fraudulent. It proves every penny was paid. And it proves Calloway knew it because the receipt has his cashier's mark." She pulled out the chair and sat down. "If we get this to the right person, someone honest, which I know is a specific requirement in the current legal climate, but they do exist, it dismantles Calloway's claim entirely. And if Calloway's claim is dismantled, then his connection to the land company starts to look very different," Nate finished. He was leaning forward now, his elbows on the table, that focused inward look she'd come to recognize as his working mind in motion. "BlackRock's been using Calloway's operation to pressure property owners into debt situations for at least 2 years. 3 ranches south of here sold under what I always thought was suspicious circumstances. Could those ranchers testify? 2 of them left the territory. The third—" He stopped. "Who's the third?" He looked at her. "Old man named Garrett. Frank Garrett. He's stubborn enough to have stayed and angry enough to have kept documentation of his own. I've been telling him for 8 months he needed a lawyer and not just a grudge." "He needs what I have in that packet," Margaret said. "And we need what he has. Between 2 independent accounts of the same scheme?" She left the sentence open. Nate finished it. "Nobody can claim it's personal. It becomes a pattern." He sat back, looked at the ceiling, then at her. "There's a U.S. Marshal named Asa Cole, based out of Helena. He came through Silver Ridge 18 months ago on a different matter. I knew him to be straight. If anyone would take this seriously. Can you get word to him? Takes time. The territory is big. We have 3 weeks now instead of 5, she said. He nodded, looked at the oilskin packet between them. May I? He waited for her nod before he reached for it. He opened it carefully. She noticed that the carefulness, the same deliberateness he gave to things he understood to be valuable, and he looked at the pages within, without touching them, beyond what was necessary to read them. She watched his face while he read. She watched him understand what he was reading. She watched the moment when he reached the cashier's receipt. She could tell by the slight change in the angle of his head, the way his eyes stopped moving and stayed in one place. He looked up. He paid it back 11 months before he died. With 14 months of interest on top of the principal, Margaret said. He paid back more than he borrowed because he didn't want any question. That was my father. She paused. That's who Calloway told people had died owing him money. Nate looked at the receipt in his hands. Then carefully he put it back. He tied the packet closed. He set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment. I'm going to ride down to Garrett's place tomorrow morning, he said. You should come. He needs to hear this from you directly. He won't trust it secondhand. He's that kind of man. And what you have needs a witness to the chain of custody before we get it to Cole. All right, she said. He looked at her. You've been carrying this the whole time? Yes. All 4 days on the mountain? Yes. And you still didn't tell anyone what you had? I didn't know anyone I could trust, she said simply. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did every night on this part of the mountain, moving through the pines with that sound that was almost like water. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the beef soup she'd left simmering on the low right side of the stove, and the oilskin packet sat on the table between them, containing everything her father had been and everything Calloway had tried to steal. Margaret, Nate said. She looked at him. I'm glad you ended up in my chicken coop, he said. It was such a plain-spoken thing. No poetry in it, no sweep of language. Just a man saying a true thing in the straightforward way he said everything. She felt it go somewhere deep, the way simple true things do when you haven't heard enough of them. I'm glad you didn't shoot me, she said. He almost smiled. I considered it. I know, the Winchester was very persuasive. To be fair, you did break the egg. I'll replace the egg, Nate. I told you at the time. You've replaced it about 40 times over at this point. Then we're even, she said, and we can stop counting. He looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, his face was less intimidating than it was in daylight. Not softer, he wasn't a soft man, but more legible. She could see the tiredness in it, and the something beneath the tiredness that wasn't so easily named. "Get some sleep," he said. "We ride early tomorrow." She nodded and stood and started clearing the table. He stood too and picked up his own dishes and brought them to the basin, and they worked side by side in the kitchen, in a silence that had become somewhere in 3 weeks of close quarters and small daily negotiations, a comfortable thing. Not easy, exactly. Nothing with this man was precisely easy. He was too quiet and too careful for easy, but comfortable. The way a good pair of work boots is comfortable, built for the actual conditions. She was hanging the dish rag when he stopped at the door to the hallway and turned back. "That man," he said. "Pierce. When he comes back, and he will come back probably within the week, let me know the moment you see them on the trail." "I will." "And Margaret." He paused. "If they come while I'm out on the range and I'm not in shouting distance, don't go out to meet them alone." She looked at him. "I can handle a conversation, Nate." "I know you can," he said without any condescension, just statement of fact. "I've watched you handle things for 3 weeks. But Pierce isn't a conversation man. He's a before and after man. He wants witnesses to see you alone and frightened. I'd rather not give him that picture to use." She thought about it, nodded. "All right." "Good night," he said. "Good night, Nate." He went down the hall. She heard his door. He always closed it quietly, which she'd noticed the particular care of a man who didn't want to disturb the house, and then the cabin went still. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the dish rag in her hand. Then she went to the window and looked out at the mountain. It was her mountain now, in the particular way things become yours when you've fought for them even briefly. Not ownership, nothing so simple as that, but belonging. She had come here running and starving, and she had broken a man's egg and been given supper and a choice, and she had made the choice. And here she was 3 weeks later with her father's ledgers on the table, and a plan that might actually work, and a man down the hall who had never once looked at her with pity and had thanked her this afternoon for fixing his fence latch in the same tone he'd used to thank a trusted partner. She put out the lamp. The next morning, they rode to Frank Garrett's place in the cold early gray, the oilskin packet in Nate's coat, and Margaret learned 2 things on that ride. The first was that Nate Granger on horseback with a purpose was a different kind of presence than Nate Granger doing domestic morning things. He was fully alert, eyes moving, reading the trail and the sky, and whatever information the mountain was providing in its various languages. And she understood, watching him, that 11 years on this land had made him fluent in something she was only beginning to learn. The second thing she learned was that people who knew him treated him differently than she'd expected. They passed through the edge of Silver Ridge on their way south. It was barely past dawn, and the town was just waking up, smoke starting from chimneys, a few figures moving on the main street. A man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store looked up and saw Nate and raised his hand in the specific gesture of someone acknowledging a person whose acknowledgement matters. A woman coming out of the dry goods stopped and watched them pass, with an expression that was partly curiosity, and Margaret thought partly something warmer. A boy of about 12 running some early errand stopped dead in the middle of the street and stared up at Nate with undisguised awe. "Morning, Mr. Granger," the boy said. "Morning, Billy," Nate said without breaking stride. "Tell your father the north fence where his property meets mine needs looking at before winter." "Yes, sir," the boy said with the solemn gravity of someone receiving an important commission. Margaret watched all of this and filed it away with everything else she was filing. The town knew this man. Not feared him, she'd been told he was feared, but that wasn't what she was seeing. They respected him. There was a difference. Fear looks away. Respect looks toward. "You have a reputation," she said once they were past the main street. "Most people do," he said. "Yours seems to be a good one." He considered this. "I try to be straight," he said. "In a place where not everyone is, it stands out more than it should." Frank Garrett's property was a smaller operation than Nate's set in a valley below the tree line, and Garrett himself was exactly what Nate had said, stubborn and angry and suspicious, in the particular way of a man who has been wronged and not remedied. He was in his late 60s, built like someone who had spent 60 years in physical argument with the land, and mostly one with white hair and the reddened, weathered face of a man who spent almost no time indoors. He did not look pleased to see them. He looked at Margaret with the blunt appraisal of a man who doesn't bother with social delicacy and said, "This Granger's wife." "Yes," Margaret said. "Since when?" "3 weeks." Garrett looked at Nate. "Fast." "Necessary," Nate said. Garrett grunted. "Come inside then, both of you." What happened in Garrett's kitchen in the next 2 hours was something Margaret would think about for a long time afterward. She laid out the ledgers on his table, the same way she had laid them out on Nate's the night before carefully, in order the receipts lined up with their corresponding entries, and she walked Garrett through every page, every date, every payment. She could tell he was the kind of man who needed to track logic in sequence, so she gave it to him in sequence, and she answered his questions without irritation, even when they were repetitive, because he was checking her, and she understood the need to be checked. When she got to the cashier's receipt from Calloway's own office, Garrett picked it up himself and held it close to read it. His hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from something being confirmed that he'd believed for a long time without being able to prove. "Same cashier," he said. "I beg your pardon," Margaret said. Garrett looked at Nate, then at Margaret. "The man who signed this receipt, that name Edford H. Edford, that's the same man who handled my transaction with Calloway." He set the receipt down. "The same man who told me my paperwork was in order right before Calloway changed the terms, and I had no record of the original agreement because Edford had conveniently kept the copy." The kitchen was very quiet. "You have documentation of your own deal with Calloway," Margaret said. "Not the original," Garrett said. "He got that. But I have letters. 3 letters from Calloway to me discussing the arrangement before the formal documents were drawn up. They reference terms that are materially different from what appeared in the final papers." His jaw worked. "I kept them because I knew. I knew from the first moment the final papers were different. I just couldn't prove what the original terms had been." "You can now," Margaret said. "Because my father's ledger shows the original terms of his agreement, and the pattern of change is identical to what you're describing." Garrett looked at her for a long time. He was the kind of man whose face didn't give much away. Years of negotiating with the land will do that. But she could see something moving behind his eyes that was equal parts grief and relief. And she understood that she was looking at a man who had been carrying his version of her father's ledgers, the weight of a truth no one had believed for a very long time. "There's a marshal," Nate said. "In Helena. Asa Cole." "I know Cole," Garrett said. "Then you know he's straight." "I know he's straight," Garrett agreed. "I also know Helena is 4 days by fast horse." "Which means someone needs to leave tomorrow," Nate said. Garrett looked at him. "You staying on the ranch?" "I need to," Nate said. "Pierce will be back within the week and someone needs to be on the property." Garrett looked at Margaret. "What about you?" "I'm staying with my husband," Margaret said. She said it without hesitation, and she felt the truth of it land somewhere in herself. Not performance, not obligation, just fact. She was staying. This was where she was. Garrett nodded once. "Then I'll go," he said. "I'm old, and I'm angry, and I've got nothing left to lose on this mountain that I haven't already lost, and I ride faster than I look." He poured them coffee that was thick enough to stand a spoon in, and they sat around his table, and they made a plan what Garrett would carry, how it would be presented, what Cole would need to act on it, rather than merely receive it with interest. Margaret wrote up a signed and dated account of her father's transaction in her own hand while they talked to accompany the ledgers, so there would be a living witness statement attached to the documentary evidence. Her handwriting was clear and steady. She'd always had good handwriting. Her father had insisted on it. "A baker who can't write a clean order loses half his customers," he'd said. "Put your name on your work so people know who to thank." She wrote her name at the bottom of the page. Margaret Ann Granger, née Dawson, daughter of Gerald Thomas Dawson. October 4th, 1884, and she looked at the name for a moment before she blotted it. Granger. Still odd, still new. But when she'd said, "I'm staying with my husband 20 minutes ago," she hadn't stumbled over either word. She handed the page to Garrett. He read it carefully, folded it, placed it inside the oilskin packet with the ledgers, and tied the cord twice. "I'll be on the trail before light," he said. "Frank," Nate said. Garrett looked up. "Thank you." Garrett looked at him for a moment, and then he looked at Margaret, and something in his weathered face shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way ground opens when a long freeze finally breaks. "Thank your wife," he said. "She's the one who thought to sew the evidence into her dress." He picked up his coffee. "That's not something a man would have thought of." Margaret bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. They rode home in the early afternoon with the sky above the mountains, that particular deep blue that means the weather is holding for now, but making no promises. Nate was quieter than usual, which was saying something, and she let him be quiet, because she'd learned by now that his silence was working. Silence, not distant, silence. Something was being turned over and examined, and he would say it when it was ready. He said it about a mile from the ranch gate. "I owe you an honesty," he said. She looked over. "All right." "When I offered you the choice work or white, I thought I was solving my land problem." He kept his eyes on the trail. "That's what I told myself. Practical solution. Fair terms. Nobody gets hurt." "And," she said, "and I've been telling myself that for 3 weeks, while you fixed my fence latch and organized my cellar and made my kitchen smell like something worth coming home to." He paused. "And while you sat across from an angry old man this morning and laid your father's work out on his table like it was the most natural thing in the world because it needed to be done." She waited. "I think," he said, "I need to tell you that it is not purely practical anymore. For me." He looked over at her, then direct and without flinching the way he looked at everything he was serious about. "And I wanted you to know that before things get more difficult, because they're going to get more difficult." Margaret looked at the trail ahead. She thought about what he'd said and what it cost a man like him to say it. She thought about the morning she'd found him talking to the barn cat. She thought about the way he waited until she nodded before he reached for her father's ledgers. "I know," she said quietly. "Which part?" "Both parts," she said. "That it's not purely practical, and that things are going to get more difficult." He nodded, looked back at the trail. "Nate," she said. I came off that mountain with nothing," she said. "Not a coin, not a friend, not a direction. I stole 3 eggs from a stranger, and he made me supper and asked me to stay." She paused. "Whatever's coming, I'd rather face it here than anywhere else I've been." He rode alongside her, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Then we face it here." The ranch came into view through the trees. The smoke was rising from the chimney the way it always rose in the afternoon, when the stove was still warm from the morning, and the barn was where it always was, and Ada nickered softly from the pasture when she heard them coming. And Margaret Granger, née Dawson, whose father had kept honest books and died owing nothing, rode home. Behind them, invisible below the mountain, Harlan Pierce was already turning his horse back toward Silver Ridge, and in his coat pocket was a new legal document with a judge's signature that he believed would end this before it properly started. He had not yet been told about the oilskin packet. He had not yet learned what Margaret had been carrying. That was about to change everything. Pierce came back on a Tuesday. Margaret saw them from the garden, not 3 riders this time, but 7, and the difference in number was its own kind of message. Pierce rode in front with his town coat and his unhurried confidence, and behind him came 2 men she recognized from the first visit, and 4 she didn't, and one of the 4 she didn't recognize was wearing a federal badge that caught the morning light. She set down her garden tool, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the porch and stood there and waited because Nate had said, "Don't go out to meet them alone," and she intended to honor that, but she was not going inside either. She was not a woman who hid on her own porch. Pierce pulled up at the fence line and looked at her with that same unhurried quality, like a man who has all day and knows it. "Mrs. Granger," he said. The title came out with a small, precise emphasis that told her he'd chosen it deliberately and found something amusing in it. "Mr. Pierce," she said. "My husband is on the property. I'll get him." "No need to rush," Pierce said. "We'll wait." She went inside to the back door and called out toward the barn in a voice that carried without shouting. Nate appeared in the barn doorway. Within 30 seconds he'd heard the horses, she realized before she had. He looked at her face, read it looked past her toward the front of the property. "How many?" he said. "7. One with a federal badge." Something moved in his jaw. He came out of the barn, pulled the barn door closed behind him, and walked around the side of the house to the front. Margaret followed him. She was not going to stand in the kitchen while this happened. Pierce watched Nate cross the yard with the particular attention of a man assessing something he's been told is dangerous and wants to evaluate for himself. He nodded when Nate reached the fence. "Granger." "Pierce." Nate looked at the 7 men, looked at the badge on the one in the back, looked back at Pierce. "Federal Marshal." "Deputy," Pierce said. "Deputy Stroud out of the Helena Land Office. He's here to officially serve notice on the survey reclassification." Pierce reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "BlackRock Capital has filed the preliminary claim on the Upper North Range based on the new federal homestead definition. The survey's been moved up. Deputy Stroud will record the official boundaries today." Nate didn't take the document. That survey date was set by the federal office for 6 weeks out. "Timeline was revised," Pierce said. "Happens when new claims are filed. Stroud has the authority." "Let me see his credentials," Nate said. Pierce's expression flickered, not much, just a tightening at the corner of his mouth that told Margaret this wasn't the response he'd planned for. He nodded to the deputy who rode forward and held out a leather card case. Nate examined it, handed it back. "Who signed the timeline revision?" Nate said. "That information is in the document," Pierce said, extending it again. "Then I'll read the document," Nate said, and this time he took it. He unfolded it without hurry and read it the way he did everything thoroughly in sequence, without being rushed by the fact that 7 men were watching him do it. Margaret stood at his left shoulder and read it with him. She saw the problem before he named it. The signature on the revision authorization, a Judge Harmon Presley of the Helena District Court, was the same name she'd seen on the forged debt documents Calloway had presented at her father's bakery. Not the same signature exactly, but the same name, the same judge. She put her hand briefly on Nate's arm. He glanced at her. She looked at the signature. He looked at it. Something passed between them that didn't require words. "Deputy Stroud," Nate said, looking up at the badge-wearing man. "You personally know Judge Presley." Stroud was younger than she'd expected for a federal deputy, mid-20s maybe, with the careful expression of a man trying to conduct himself correctly in a situation he wasn't entirely sure about. "I work out of his district, yes, sir," he said. "He signed documents for BlackRock Capital often." Stroud's careful expression got more careful. "I couldn't say, sir." "Couldn't say or don't know," Nate said. "I process what I'm given," Stroud said, and the faint tightening around his eyes told Margaret he had perhaps some private thoughts on the subject that his official position prevented him from expressing. Pierce stepped his horse forward slightly. "Granger, we can do this 2 ways. You can accept the notice today, which gives you 10 days to file a contest through the proper channels. Or you can refuse the notice, which means we document the refusal and the claim processes without your participation. Either way, the result is the same." "The result," Nate said, "is not the same. And you know that." "The Upper Range." "The Upper Range has been part of this property claim for 11 years, Nate said. "My homestead documentation is filed with the Territorial Land Office in Silver Ridge, witnessed by the county recorder, and includes continuous use records going back to 1873. If your survey deputy goes onto that land today, he's trespassing on a documented claim." Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man who has heard this argument before and has an answer prepared. "Your documentation predates the new federal homestead definition, which requires a family unit as condition of the homestead classification. You were a single man on a mountain claim, Granger. That doesn't meet the current standard. I'm not a single man, Nate said. Nate. Your marriage, Pierce said, and the small emphasis he put on the word was precisely calibrated, is quite recent. The new definition requires establishment of family homestead. A 3-week marriage doesn't establish a family homestead, it establishes a 3-week marriage. He looked at Margaret. No offense to your wife. None taken, Margaret said before Nate could respond. She stepped forward to the fence. Mr. Pierce, may I ask you something directly? Pierce looked at her with the expression men like him always wore when women spoke in legal contexts, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath the expression of someone waiting for the interruption to end. Of course, Mrs. Granger. Are you aware that Silas Calloway has a documented financial relationship with BlackRock Capital? She said. The politeness on Pierce's face didn't change, but something behind it did. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do, she said. I think you know that Calloway has been identifying property owners under debt pressure and referring them to BlackRock, and that BlackRock has been using forged court documents signed by Judge Presley, who seems to find himself useful to a remarkable variety of legal proceedings to accelerate land seizures. She held his gaze. I think you've known that for some time, and I think you know that we have documentation. The 7 men on horseback were very still. Pierce's smile had not moved, but it had gone from a real expression to a held one, the way a flame holds position before a wind hits it. You have documentation, he repeated. My father's financial ledgers, she said. Original documents, his handwriting. Every transaction he made, including the one with Calloway that Calloway's been claiming, was never settled. With the original receipt from Calloway's own cashier. She paused. A cashier named H. Edford, who, as it turns out, processed transactions for at least one other BlackRock target in this territory. Pierce was quiet for a count of 3. Then he looked at Nate. Granger, I'm going to strongly advise you. We've sent copies to Marshal Asa Cole in Helena, Nate said. It was a slight overstatement they'd sent originals with Garrett, not copies, but she understood the strategic value of the phrasing and didn't correct it. He should have them by now. Another silence. Longer this time. Deputy Stroud in the back of the group had stopped looking at Pierce and started looking at the ground between his horse's ears with the focused attention of a man who is reconsidering a number of recent professional decisions. We'll be filing the contest through the proper channels, Nate said. Today, in Silver Ridge. You're welcome to note that in whatever you're recording, Deputy. Pierce folded his document, put it back in his coat, looked at Nate for a moment with an expression that had dropped any pretense of the legal politeness and was now simply the face of a man calculating odds. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. No, Nate said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it should be. He looked at the 7 men. You're standing on my property line. I'd appreciate it if you went back down the mountain. Pierce looked at him, looked at Margaret, looked at the 7 men he'd brought, half of whom were not meeting anyone's eyes. He turned his horse. They all turned their horses. She and Nate stood at the fence and watched them go in silence. She counted to 30 after the last horse disappeared into the tree line, before she let herself breathe the full breath she'd been holding for the past 15 minutes. That was a bluff, she said. About the copies. Partial bluff, he said. Garrett has the originals. If he reached Cole by now, Cole has them. If not, he paused. We needed Pierce off the property to give us time. How much time did that buy us? A day, maybe 2. He turned toward the barn. I need to ride to Silver Ridge and file the contest today, before Pierce does anything else. I'm coming with you. He looked back at her, started to say something. I'm coming with you, Nate, she said. That documentation connects to my father. If anyone challenges its origin, I need to be there to speak to it. A pause. Then, be ready in 10 minutes. They were ready in 8. What happened in Silver Ridge that afternoon was the beginning of something Margaret had not quite believed would happen, not because she doubted the truth of what she carried, but because she had learned in the year since her father died that truth and official recognition of truth were two distinct territories with a significant distance between them. Holt at the registrar's office took the contest filing with the expression of a man who would rather be doing anything else and knew he had no basis to refuse it. He stamped it, dated it, gave them a copy. Margaret watched him do each step and made sure he knew she was watching, because men who talk tend to talk more carefully when they know they're being observed. On the way out on this boardwalk, they nearly walked into the woman Margaret had noticed watching them from in front of the dry goods on the morning they'd ridden to Garrett's. Up close, she was a handsome woman in her 40s, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a practical dress that said "working woman," and a set of silver earrings that said she had opinions about what working women were allowed to want. "Mrs. Granger," the woman said with a directness that bypassed the usual frontier social preamble entirely. Margaret stopped. "Yes." "Ruth Calver. I run the boarding house on the East End." She looked at Margaret with that sharp, assessing gaze. "I knew your husband before you did, which is to say I knew him as a man who fixed my fence post when it came down in a storm and didn't ask for anything in return and wouldn't hear of payment, which is a rarer type of man than it ought to be." "It is," Margaret agreed. "I've also heard what Pierce is doing up the mountain," Ruth said, glancing at Nate. "And I've heard you've been making some claims about Calloway." "True claims," Margaret said. Ruth looked at her for a moment with that evaluating gaze. Then she said, 3 years ago, Calloway came after my brother's cattle operation south of Billings. Same pattern you're describing. My brother had documentation that something was wrong with the paperwork, but he couldn't find anyone who'd look at it seriously, and he eventually gave up the land at a loss." She paused. "He still has the documentation." Margaret stared at her. "Mrs. Calver." "Ruth." "Ruth. Is your brother reachable?" "He's in Miles City," Ruth said. "But I can write him today." Nate, who had been listening with his hat in his hand and his eyes moving between the two women in the way of a man witnessing something that has grown beyond his direct participation, said, "Ruth, if your brother's documentation shows the same cashier, I'd stake money on it," Ruth said flatly. "Edford. That's the name, isn't it? My brother mentioned that name." She looked at Margaret with something that was both hard-edged and warm, the look of a woman who respects another woman who holds her ground. "You're not the first one Calloway went after, but you might be the first one with enough pieces to actually put the whole picture together." She handed Margaret a piece of paper she'd apparently prepared before this conversation, an address in Miles City, and her brother's name. "Get word to me when you know what you need from him," she said. "He'll cooperate. He's been waiting for someone to make it worth cooperating." She nodded to Nate, turned, and walked back into the dry goods with the efficiency of a woman who has a great deal to do and has already allocated her time precisely. Nate looked at Margaret. "She knew we were filing today." "Half the town knew we were filing today," Margaret said. "Holt talks. He does." He looked at the paper in her hand. 3 documented cases. 3 that we know of, she said, and a cashier whose name appears in all of them. They rode home through the long mountain afternoon, and what Margaret was thinking, what she couldn't stop turning over, was not the legal strategy, which was coming together faster than she'd dared hope. What she was thinking about was that Calloway had looked at her father's ledger and had seen only the number. A debt, an asset, a leverage point. He had not looked at her father at all. Not at the man who woke before dawn every day to get the ovens going, who kept every receipt from every transaction because he believed that honest records were a form of respect, who had taught his daughter that your name on your work means something. Calloway had looked at the ledger and seen a tool, and that was all. And she thought, he is going to lose because my father kept good records. He is going to lose because a careful, honest man wrote everything down. Her father had been, in the end, his own best witness. She was 2 miles from the ranch gate when she saw the smoke. Not chimney smoke. Not the particular gray column of the wood stove running warm in the afternoon. This was thicker and lower and coming from the wrong direction from the east, where the barn was, where Ada was, where the 2 barn cats and the dogs and 11 years of Nathaniel Granger's work lived. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Nate had seen it the same instant she had, and he was already pushing his horse from a trot to a gallop, and she was right behind him. They came through the gate at a full run, and the barn was not on fire. She registered that with a physical wave of relief so strong it made her dizzy. But the east fence line was, or had been, the near posts smoldering, and one section knocked down entirely. And in the middle of the yard between the house and the barn, 3 men were waiting. Not Pierce's men. These were different men, harder with the specific look of men who were not here for legal proceedings. The one in front had a scar across his left eyebrow and was holding a repeating rifle across his saddle with the ease of someone who has made the particular calculation that the law is sufficiently far away to not be a factor. Margaret pulled Ada up short, and Ada expressed her objections to this loudly, and the man with the scar looked at her and then at Nate and smiled in a way that had nothing pleasant in it. "Granger," he said. "Calloway sends his regards." Nate had his hand on his own rifle. "Who are you?" "Name's Voss," the man said. "My associates and I are here to collect something Calloway says belongs to him." His eyes moved to Margaret. "His debt." "There is no debt," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She was deeply afraid, and her voice was steady, and she made a private note that her father would have been proud of both things. "That was proven fraudulent. We've filed documentation with a federal marshal." Voss looked at her with the patient attention of a man to whom documentation was not a meaningful concept. "That may be," he said. "But until the marshal does whatever marshals do, Calloway says the debt stands and the woman comes with us." He looked back at Nate. "His preference would be quiet, you being the reasonable kind of man your reputation suggests." "My reputation," Nate said, "is not that I'm reasonable." He swung down from his horse in a single movement and put himself between Margaret and the 3 men. "My reputation is that I know this mountain better than any man alive, and I'm not someone you want to be hunting on it." Voss's smile stayed in place. "3 of us, Granger." "I can count," Nate said. "Can you?" Voss looked at the other 2 men, a quick consulting look. The look of a man checking that his arithmetic is shared, and in that precise moment, while his attention moved, Nate stepped left and put himself beside Ada's flank in a position that gave him the horse as cover and the clear line to the barn door he'd apparently been calculating since the moment they rode in. "Margaret," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear it. "Barn. Back left corner. There's a rifle behind the feed chest. You know how to use it." She knew how to use it. Her father had insisted. She slid off Ada's back, keeping the horse between her and Voss's line of sight, and moved toward the barn, with her heart hammering, and her mind doing the particular thing it does under pressure, going very quiet, very clear, like water that stops moving and shows you the bottom. She heard Voss behind her. "Now that's not a good idea." She heard Nate. "Talk to me, not to her." She was inside the barn. She found the feed chest in the back left corner. She found the rifle behind it exactly where he said it would be. A Winchester repeater loaded. She checked her father had always insisted you check, and she moved back toward the barn door and looked out. The 3 men were still mounted. Nate was standing in the yard between her and them, and he was not holding his rifle. She understood why the odds weren't there yet, but he was standing in the way of a man who has made a complete decision about where he is and is not going to be moved from it. Voss was talking. She couldn't hear the words at this distance, but she could read the posture, still negotiating, still calculating, not yet committed. The man on Voss's left was watching the barn. The man on his right was watching Nate. She stepped into the barn doorway. "Mr. Voss." All 3 men looked at her. At the rifle she was holding, which was pointed at the ground, she wasn't going to point it at a man without cause. Her father had been clear on that too, but which was unambiguously present. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nate. Then he looked back at her, and she could see the arithmetic moving behind his eyes. Not fear men like Voss didn't frighten easily, but the particular calculation of whether a job was worth its complication. "Calloway didn't mention you were armed," Voss said. "Calloway doesn't know me very well," Margaret said. "He knows you ran from him." "I stopped running," she said. "This is where I stopped. Another silence. The kind that has weight to it. The afternoon light was going low and golden, and the smoldering fence posts had settled to a thin curl of smoke, and somewhere in the barn behind her, Ada had stopped moving and was listening. "You filed that contest today," Voss said, not to her, but to Nate. "It's filed," Nate said. "And this Marshall in Helena has everything he needs." Voss looked at the rifle in Margaret's hands, looked at Nate, looked at the mountain behind the ranch, at the ridges and the tree lines, and the terrain that was as advertised entirely Nate Granger's territory, in a way it would never be theirs. "This ain't over," Voss said. "I know," Nate said. Voss turned his horse. The other two followed. They rode south, not down toward Silver Ridge, but southeast into the rougher country, and Margaret watched them until she couldn't see them anymore. And then she let herself lower the rifle and lean against the barn door frame and breathe. Nate crossed the yard and took the rifle from her hands with the same care he gave. Everything checked it, set the safety. Then he looked at her. "You all right?" he said. "Ask me in a few minutes," she said. He nodded. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just a moment, just the weight of it. And then he went to look at the fence posts, because the fence posts needed looking at, and that was the kind of man he was. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him go, and she thought, Voss said it wasn't over, and he was right, and we both know it. Because Calloway wasn't sending Voss to negotiate. Calloway was sending Voss to see what they had, to measure the resistance, to go back and report that the woman was armed and the man knew the mountain, and there were legal filings in Silver Ridge and a name in Helena, and then Calloway would decide what the mountain was worth to him at that cost. And a man like Calloway, a man who had forged documents and bought judges and built a scheme across a territory for 2 years, did not stop because the first push met resistance. He sent more men. She helped Nate fix the fence posts that evening by lamplight. He dug and she held the posts level, and he packed the earth around the bases with a tamping tool, and they worked in the specific silence of people who are both tired and thinking, and the night came down around them cool and clear. When they came inside, she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he spread out the property map, the original survey records from 1873, annotated in his own hand over 11 years, until the margins were dense with notes about water flow and seasonal trail conditions, and fence dates, and everything else. A man learns about a piece of land when he lives on it long enough to love it. "They'll come at night next time," he said, not frightened, just stating the facts of the terrain the way he stated everything. Voss isn't going to come back down the mountain empty-handed twice. "How many access points?" she said. He looked at her. It was the right question, she could tell by the brief shift in his expression. He turned the map toward her and walked her through it. 3 main trails. 2 secondary approaches that were difficult enough that men unfamiliar with the mountain would likely avoid them. 1 ridge approach that looked accessible on a map and was in fact nearly impossible without knowing which specific path through the rock to take. "You know all of this," she said. "Every inch," he said. 11 years. "Then we use it," she said. "The mountain is your advantage. Make it work." He looked at the map, then at her. "You're not frightened," he said. It wasn't a compliment or a question, it was an observation he was checking. "I'm frightened constantly," she said. "I've been frightened since the morning Calloway showed up at my father's bakery." "Fear doesn't leave. You just decide what you're going to do alongside it." She looked at the map. "What I know is that I'm not running again. I ran for 4 days and I ended up on your mountain, and it turned out to be exactly where I needed to be. I'm not going backward." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she'd stopped trying to name. It was too specific to him. Too much the particular expression of this particular man, and she thought it might take years to fully read it, and she found she didn't mind the prospect. "There's a place on the North Ridge," he said, "above the first access trail. You can see anyone coming from half a mile out, day or night, if there's moon enough. I want to start keeping watch from up there. You can't watch all night and work the ranch all day." "I know," he said. "Then we take shifts," she said. He looked at her. Margaret. I know how to stay awake and I know how to shout when I see something, she said. Don't tell me I can't contribute to the watch on my own property. My own property. She'd said it without thinking. It landed between them on the table, the naturalness of it, and she saw him register it the same way she had, not with surprise exactly, but with something that was a version of the barn cat's ears going forward. All right, he said. They started the watch rotation that night. She took the first shift the late evening hours, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket on the north ridge, with the lamp shuttered to a thin line and the Winchester propped against the rock beside her. The mountain was extraordinary at night, the sounds of it, the scale of the dark sky above the peaks, the way the cold carried on it, a kind of clarity that the day didn't have. She could see the access trail below, winding pale through the dark timber, and she watched it with the focused attention her father had given to his ledgers, and she thought about him as she often did in quiet moments. She thought, I'm on a mountain in Montana, Papa. And I'm married to a man I met 25 days ago, and I'm standing watch at midnight with a Winchester, and I'm not afraid of it. I'm not afraid. She thought, I think you would have liked him. He means what he says. Nate came to relieve her at 2 a.m, walking up the ridge path without a lamp, because he could have done it in pitch dark, and probably had. He handed her a tin of coffee when he reached her, already poured, still hot. Anything, he said. Quiet, she said. She took the coffee and wrapped her hands around it. He settled into the position she'd vacated, his back against the rock, his eyes going immediately to the trail below, with the ease of someone who had been monitoring things most of his adult life. Nate, she said. When this is over. She stopped, started again. When Cole gets to the filings and Calloway's scheme is documented and the land claim is settled, what happens to you? To all of this? He was quiet a moment. The ranch stays mine, the water rights hold, life goes back to what it was. What was it? She said. Before I came. He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than reaching for an easy answer. Quiet, he said finally. Useful, not... He paused. Not empty, but not full either. She held the coffee. The cold had come in fully now, and the stars above the peaks were extraordinary in the way that stars only get when you're above most of the light in the world. And now? She said. He was quiet for another moment. She could see the line of his jaw against the dark sky, the set of his shoulders, the stillness that was his version of being completely present. Now, he said, there's coffee waiting when I come in from the morning chores. He paused. And someone who fixed the cellar latch. She looked at him. There was the edge of something in his voice, not quite humor, not quite sentiment, but that particular frequency between the two that she'd been learning to hear. That's your answer, she said. Coffee and a latch. And, he said, someone who stood in a barn doorway with a rifle and didn't flinch. He looked at her. And who asked about water rights on a map like she'd been reading land surveys her whole life? Another pause. And who is currently sitting on a cold mountain at midnight because she decided this is where she stopped running? She looked at him. The mountain was quiet around them. Those aren't small things, she said. No, he said. They're not. She handed him back the empty tin and stood, pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Don't miss the southeast approach, she said. You can see it from the second rock outcrop if you angle left. I know, he said. But he looked where she'd pointed and nodded. She went back down the trail to the cabin. She was halfway down when she heard it nod on the trail. Not a human sound, but somewhere in the timber to the east. A branch. Specific, deliberate, the kind of sound that happens when weight moves through it with intent. She stopped. She stood perfectly still and listened. Silence. Then another branch. Closer. She turned and went back up the ridge at a run, not calling out because sound carried unpredictably on the mountain at night, and she didn't know yet what she'd heard. She reached Nate in 40 seconds and touched his arm, and he was already turning, because he'd heard it too. East Timber, she breathed. He nodded. He'd heard it. He was already reading the sound, the direction, the distance with 11 years of mountain knowledge calibrating each variable. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed southeast. 2 men, coming from the southeast secondary approach. The one he'd said was difficult without knowing the path, except someone had told them the path. He looked at her. His face in the dark was completely level, not frightened, never frightened, but absolutely focused, and she matched it with everything she had. He pointed down the ridge to the left, and she understood without words the position below would cut off the secondary approach before it reached the barn. He pointed at her, then at the position. She nodded. He handed her the Winchester, looked at her for 1 full second with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark, but felt somewhere below the cold and the fear and the clarity of the immediate moment land squarely in the center of her chest. Then he moved right up the ridge, using the rocks as cover, making not a single sound she could detect. And Margaret Granger née Dawson, who had come off a mountain 4 weeks ago with broken eggs on her hands and nowhere to go, moved left. Into position. In the dark. On her own land. She heard the men below in the timber, heard them come closer. She could make out their shapes now, 2 figures working their way up through the trees, not rushing, thinking they were undetected. They were moving toward the barn, and she understood what they intended not to take her, not tonight, not with Voss's report fresh. Tonight, they intended to burn something that would hurt more than a fence post. She was not going to let that happen. She set the Winchester against her shoulder and aimed at the sky above the tree line. Not at the men, never at the men, unless it came to that, and she fired once. The shot cracked through the mountain dark, like a door slamming on everything that had been quiet. The 2 shapes below stopped moving. From the ridge above her, she heard Nate's voice carry down with the particular carrying quality of a man who knows how sound moves on a mountain and has used it to his advantage. "You are on private property. There are 2 rifles on you, and I know every inch of this ground in the dark. Think carefully about your next move." The silence that followed was complete. Then she heard crashing in the timber. Not the careful, controlled movement of men coming up, the crashing of men going down fast, abandoning quiet for speed, retreating. She stayed in position until the sound was gone entirely. Then she lowered the rifle and breathed. Nate came down the ridge. He stood beside her and listened for another full minute before he said anything. "They're gone," he said. "For tonight," she said. "Yes." He took the Winchester from her gently, checked it. "Good shot. High and left of anyone." "I wasn't trying to hit anyone." "I know. That's why it was a good shot." She looked at the dark tree line where the men had been. "They'll be back with more." "Tomorrow night, probably," he said. "Or the night after. Calloway will know by morning that we saw them coming, and he'll have to decide whether to escalate or wait." "What do you think he'll do?" Nate was quiet for a moment. In the east, very faint, the first gray edge of what would eventually be dawn was just beginning to suggest itself against the peaks. "I think," he said, "that a man like Calloway can only wait so long before fear of losing everything he's built starts to feel worse than the risk of finishing it." He looked at her. "Which means we're running out of time." "Then Cole needs to move," she said. "Yes," Nate said. "He does." He looked out at the mountain, at the land he'd spent 11 years building into something that mattered. And she stood beside him, and she looked at it too. Her land now, her fight, her mountain, in all the ways a place becomes yours, when you're willing to stand on it in the dark with a rifle and fire into the sky to protect it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He looked at her, and there it was again, that expression she was still learning, that particular frequency between almost humor and almost tenderness, that was entirely and specifically Nathaniel Granger. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They walked down the ridge together in the last of the mountain dark, and somewhere below in Silver Ridge, a rider was already saddling a horse, carrying news back to Silas Calloway. And in Helena, a marshal named Asa Cole was sitting down to his morning coffee with a very interesting packet of documents that had arrived the previous afternoon from an angry old man named Garrett, who rode faster than he looked. Everything was moving now. There was no stopping it. And in the cabin on the mountain, Margaret Granger set the coffee to boil, and she was not afraid. The rider arrived at dawn. Margaret was at the stove when she heard the horse one animal moving fast, pushing hard up the mountain trail in a way that said the rider either didn't care about the animal or cared very much about arriving quickly. She set down the coffee pot and went to the window, and Nate was already out the door before she got there, which told her he'd been listening for something all morning without saying so. She followed him outside. The rider was young, barely 20 by her estimate, and he'd ridden the horse hard enough that the animal was blowing and dark with sweat. He pulled up at the gate and looked at Nate with the expression of someone delivering a message he's been told is urgent and has taken that instruction seriously all the way up the mountain. "You Granger," he said. "I am," Nate said. The boy reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "From Marshal Cole's office in Helena. Came into Silver Ridge last night by wire, and the operator said I should write it up first light." He held the paper out. "Said don't wait." Nate took it, unfolded it. Margaret came and stood at his shoulder and read it with him. The wire was brief, the way official communications are brief when the situation is serious enough that extra words feel like a liability. Cole had received the documents. Cole had reviewed the documents. Cole was sending 2 deputies to Silver Ridge ahead of himself and would follow within 48 hours. The wire instructed Nate to file no further independent actions until Cole arrived to maintain possession of the property and to make no statements to BlackRock representatives or their associated parties without a federal officer present. The last line said, "Keep your wife close. What she carries changes everything." Nate folded the paper. He looked at the rider. "You need water for your horse and something to eat before you go back down." "I'm all right," the boy started. "Your horse isn't," Nate said in the tone that ended conversations. He nodded toward the barn. "Water's in the trough. Come inside when he's settled." The boy came inside and Margaret gave him biscuits and coffee, and he ate with the focused urgency of someone who hadn't had breakfast and had been riding since before the sun came up. He was gone within 20 minutes back down the trail with his horse rested and watered and a wrapped parcel of biscuits in his coat that Margaret had put there while he wasn't looking. When he was out of sight, she turned to Nate. 48 hours, she said, if he rides hard from Helena. He was looking at the paper again. Cole's a methodical man. He'll have already verified the documents are what Garrett said they were before he sent this wire. Which means he believed it. Which means the evidence held up to a real examination, Nate said. That's different from believing it. Cole doesn't believe things. He establishes them. She sat down at the table. Calloway will hear about the wire. Probably already has, Nate said. He sat across from her. Holt at the registrar, the telegraph operator. Somebody talks and somebody listens, and Calloway pays enough people in Silver Ridge that news travels to him faster than it travels to us. She looked at him. Then he knows Cole is coming. He knows Cole is coming, Nate confirmed. So his window to do something before a federal marshal arrives is 48 hours, Nate said. Same 2 words, different weight. They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the oilskin packet between them. She'd gotten it back from Nate's coat the night before and put it on the table where she could see it because she'd spent too long carrying that weight not to want to know where it was, and they both understood what they were dealing with. A man who had spent 2 years building a scheme across a territory did not walk away from it because a marshal sent a wire. He accelerated. We need to tell Ruth Calver, Margaret said. If she's been asking questions around town about her brother's documentation, she's a target. I'll ride down this morning, Nate said. We'll ride down this morning, she said. He looked at her, started to say something. Cole's wire said keep me close, she said. I intend to interpret that in the most useful way possible. He pressed his lips together over what might have been a smile. Get your coat, he said. They were 20 minutes down the trail when Nate pulled up his horse and held up one hand. She stopped Ada immediately and listened. Below them, where the trail curved around the granite outcrop, she could hear voices. More than 2. The particular quality of men who aren't bothering to keep their sound down because they believe they're in control of the situation. Nate backed his horse off the trail into the timber. She followed without being told. They tied the horses and went forward on foot to the edge of the outcrop and looked down. Voss. And not 2 men this time, 5, including the same scarred face and the flat eyes she'd catalogued on the first visit. They were spread across the trail in a way that wasn't casual. They were positioned, waiting. Voss looked up in the direction of the ranch, waiting for them to come down the mountain. He knew they'd need to come down. He knew about the wire. She understood that immediately he'd been told they'd received it, and he'd positioned himself to intercept. Margaret looked at Nate. He was reading the arrangement of 5 men with his quick, practical mountain man arithmetic angles, distances, terrain advantages. She watched him calculate, and she watched him reach a conclusion she could read in the slight tightening of his jaw before he turned to her. "We can't go around them without losing 2 hours," he said quietly. "There's no alternate route at this elevation that comes out ahead of their position." "Can we go back to the ranch and wait?" she said. "If we go back to the ranch, they follow us up." He looked at the 5 men. Voss came up from the east approach. That means he knows the secondary trails. Last night's men reported back and Calloway gave him the map. "Someone gave Calloway a map of your mountain," she said. "Someone who's been on it," Nate said. There was something in his voice on that sentence, not betrayal exactly, not surprise, but the particular flatness of a man confronting a thing he'd suspected and hoped was wrong. "Deputy Stroud," he said. "The federal deputy Pierce brought. He was on the property long enough to look." She thought about young Stroud with his careful expression and his eyes going to the ground between his horse's ears during the confrontation at the fence. The look of a man reconsidering his professional decisions. Maybe she thought, or maybe reconsidering had come too late. "What do we do?" she said. Nate was quiet for a count of 5. Then, "We don't run, and we don't hide." He looked at her. "We go back to the ranch, and we hold it until Cole's deputies arrive. They should be in Silver Ridge by tomorrow morning if they left Helena yesterday. And if Voss comes up the mountain tonight, then we make the mountain work against him," Nate said with a quiet certainty that was not bravado. It was the voice of a man stating a fact about his own terrain. He knows the trails now. He doesn't know the mountain. They went back to the horses and rode back up. When they came through the ranch gate, Margaret went straight to the kitchen, and Nate went to the barn, and when he came back inside 10 minutes later, he was carrying 2 additional rifles and a box of ammunition that he set on the kitchen table with a methodical calm. She looked at the rifles, looked at him. "You expected this," she said. "I expected something like this," he said, "since the night Voss first came." He began checking the rifles with the focused efficiency of a man who has done this many times before and takes no shortcuts in it. "I want you to know where everything is. Every rifle, every box of shells where I keep the spare ammunition in the cellar, and why." She sat down and listened to him tell her, and she memorized it the way she'd memorized her father's ledgers completely in sequence, because information like this was exactly like a financial record. The value of it was in the accuracy. When he finished, she said, "What are you most worried about?" He was quiet a moment. "Fire," he said. "Voss tried the fence post last time. If he comes tonight with more men and they split some at the front approach, some at the east, they can keep us occupied at one point, while the others set a fire at another." "How do we prevent that?" "We can't prevent it entirely," he said. "What we can do is make the cost of attempting it high enough that it's not worth the attempt." He looked at the rifles. "And we make sure they know the mountain is watching them every step of the way up." She thought about what that meant in practice, a man and a woman on a mountain ranch against hired men who'd been given the map of the approaches. She thought about what her father would have said about odds like that. He would have said honest work done with both hands is worth more than dishonest work done with 10. "Tell me the plan," she said. "All of it. Don't spare the difficult parts because you think I'll be frightened." He looked at her. "I know you won't be frightened." "Then don't spare them." He told her. All of it. The positions he intended to use on the ridge. The signal 1 rifle shot that would mean she needed to move from one position to another. The things she should do if he was out of communication range, and something happened she hadn't anticipated. He told her where the deed papers were kept in the false bottom of the supply chest in the cellar in a tin box in case anything happened to him, and she needed to present them herself. He told her this last part looking directly at her without softening it, because she had asked him not to spare the difficult parts, and he honored that. She did not let herself think about what in case anything happens to him meant in full. She filed the information, and she moved on. "All right," she said when he was done. "Tell me one more thing." "What?" "The barn cat," she said. "The gray one. If things go badly tonight, if there's fire, she won't come out on her own. You'd need to go in for her." He stared at her. Of everything she might have said in that moment, this was apparently not on his list. "I know where she hides," he said finally. "Back left corner behind the grain." "I know," Margaret said. "I just wanted you to know that I know you'd go in for her." She looked at him steadily. "That's the kind of man you are. And that's why tonight is going to be all right." He looked at her for a long moment, with that expression she'd been learning since the first morning, the one she didn't have a word for yet, the one that lived between the things he said and the things he didn't. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture of protection, not comfort exactly. The gesture of one person acknowledging another person as equally present in a shared moment. "Margaret," he said. "Nate. Whatever happens tonight," he stopped, started again. "I want you to know that the two conditions you named, that morning with the coffee, you've kept both of them." She turned her hand under his and held it back. "So have you," she said. Outside, the afternoon was burning down toward evening. They had maybe 4 hours of useful light left. They used every minute of them. Ruth Calver arrived at the ranch just before dusk, which was the first thing that had surprised Margaret in several hours. The woman rode up the trail alone on a gray horse she handled with the competence of someone who had been riding before Silver Ridge had a proper street, and she pulled up at the gate with a canvas bag over her saddle and a look on her face that said she'd heard something and had made a decision about it. Nate came out of the barn and looked at her. "Ruth, I heard Voss was on the trail this morning," she said. "I heard the wire came up from Helena." She looked at the ranch, at Margaret in the doorway, at the rifles Nate had been arranging on the porch. "I'm not going back down the mountain tonight," she said. "So you might as well put me somewhere useful." "Ruth," Nate started, "I brought food, and I brought my own Winchester, and I've been shooting since I was 11 years old," Ruth said. "Don't argue with me, Nathaniel Granger. I've known you too long for it to work." He looked at her, looked at Margaret. Margaret raised her eyebrows in a way that she intended to communicate both "your call" and "I like her" simultaneously. "East Porch," he said. "You've got the approach from the secondary trail. You know what it looks like from up here? Show me once." Ruth said, climbing down from her horse. "I'll have it." He showed her once. She had it. The three of them ate a fast supper that Margaret put together from whatever came to hand, most quickly cold biscuits, salt pork, dried apple, and they didn't talk much because there wasn't much left to say about what was coming. The talking had been done. The plan was the plan. When darkness came fully down, they went to their positions. Margaret had the north ridge same as the night before, same rock she'd sat against, same view down the main approach trail. The moon was higher tonight, and the trail was more visible, a pale thread through the dark timber. She settled in with the Winchester across her knees and the wool blanket around her shoulders, and she looked at that trail, and she thought about her father. She thought, "I'm going to win this, Papa. I'm going to win it for both of us." The first 2 hours were quiet, in the way that precedes things rather than follows them. The quality of quiet that has intention inside it, waiting. Then she heard them. Not one or two this time. She counted 4 distinct sets of sound in the timber below movement that was trying to be careful and wasn't quite careful enough. They were coming up the main trail, which meant there were others she couldn't hear yet coming at the other approaches. She fired the signal shot into the sky above the tree line, high, clear, unmistakable, and then moved to the second position Nate had shown her, the one that had the angle on the trail junction where the main approach split toward the barn and the house. From somewhere on the east side of the property, she heard Ruth's signal shot answer hers. 2 shots. East approach also active. Nate's voice carried from the ridge above her, with that particular mountain carrying quality he used deliberately. You're on private property that's under federal claim protection. Marshal Cole's deputies are due in Silver Ridge by morning. Every man on this mountain tonight is interfering with a federal proceeding. It was not a bluff this time. It was simply true, and stated by a man whose voice at full carrying volume on a mountain he'd owned for 11 years had a weight to it that was difficult to dismiss. Below her on the main trail, the movement had stopped. She heard someone, Voss, she thought by the particular quality of the voice, say something she couldn't make out entirely, but caught the shape of. An instruction, brief and sharp. The movement resumed. Coming up, she raised the Winchester and aimed it at a point 6 feet above the trail, and waited, and when the first shape came into the gap in the trees, she fired not at it above it, with the precise aim her father had insisted on, in the same tone he'd insisted on good handwriting, and the crack of it on the mountain was enormous. Next one! Nate's voice came from above, calm and final, as a courthouse door is lower. A second figure had emerged beside the first. She could see them in the moonlight at the gap. 2 men stopped looking up at the ridge. One of them said something to the other. The other shook his head. They were running the odds. She could almost hear the calculation from where she sat. The marshal's deputies in Silver Ridge tomorrow morning. The federal proceeding language. The woman on the ridge who had just fired a rifle with the composure of someone who knew what she was doing. The man on the mountain who'd lived on it 11 years and was going to know every step they took. From the east she heard Ruth's voice, not shouting, just carrying with the flat certainty of a woman who is not interested in discussion. I know your horse Denny Alcott, and I know your mother, and she will be mortified. Go home. A silence. Then the sound of someone in the eastern timber actually beginning to go back down the mountain. Margaret almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and held position. Below, on the main trail, the 2 figures had not moved. Then she heard footsteps retreat, the careful backing away of men who have recalculated. But Voss. She didn't hear Voss retreating. She heard him off to the left, off the trail, moving through the brush toward the barn, at an angle that avoided both her position and the ridge above. He'd sent the others in as distraction. He was moving alone. She left her position. Moving parallel to him, using the terrain Nate had walked her through, the rock line that ran along the property's north edge, gave her a path that was faster than the brush route Voss was using. She moved along it in the dark with her heart hammering and her feet finding the ground with the particular careful attention of someone who cannot afford to fall. She reached the barn corner before he did. She pressed herself against the wall and listened, and heard him in the brush 10 yards out, and she raised her voice and said, "Mr. Voss, stop where you are." He stopped. A beat of silence. Then his voice came back, and it was rough now, stripped of the earlier studied calm. "You're going to point a rifle at me again." "I'm going to point a rifle at you again," she confirmed. "You won't shoot me. I won't shoot you unless you take another step toward this barn," she said. "But I will shoot that rifle out of your hand if you raise it, and then I'll shoot the ground close enough to your boots to make the point. I'm a very good shot, Mr. Voss. My father insisted." A silence. "Calloway's done," she said. "You know that. The documents are in Cole's hands. Edford will give testimony to save himself the moment Cole sits across a table from him. Judge Presley's signature is on enough fraudulent documents that his own clerk is going to distance himself before the week is out." She kept her voice steady. "This job is over. Whatever Calloway is paying you, he won't be paying anyone anything in 6 months. You're risking a federal charge for a man who is going to prison." Another silence. Longer. "You're a baker's daughter," Voss said. It wasn't contemptuous. It sounded oddly like simple astonishment. "I am," she said. "My father kept honest books. It turns out that matters." The sound in the brush shifted, not toward the barn, sideways, then back. She heard him retreating through the brush at an angle that would take him back to the eastern approach, the way down off the mountain. He left without another word. She stood at the barn wall for a full minute before she let the rifle lower. Then she sat down with her back against the barn boards, and she breathed, in and out. The barn cat appeared from somewhere. She had no idea how the gray cat managed to materialize in the dark without warning, but she'd stopped being surprised by it and sat down approximately 4 inches from her knee and looked at her with the focused feline attention of someone who has been monitoring the situation and found the outcome acceptable. "I know," Margaret said to the cat. Nate found her there 8 minutes later. He came around the barn corner and saw her sitting on the ground, and his stride changed. She heard it, the slight acceleration, and then he saw the rifle in her hand and the cat beside her knee, and she looked up at him. "Voss is gone," she said. He crouched down to her level, looked at her face. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at the cat. "He called me a baker's daughter." "You are a baker's daughter. I know. I told him it turned out to matter." She pushed herself up off the ground using the barn wall for support, and he put his hand under her elbow to help, and she let him. "Ruth. East approach is clear. She's fine. Possibly angrier than before, if that's possible." She told a man named Denny Alcott that his mother would be mortified. Did it work? He went back down the mountain. Nate stood beside her, and he looked at the darkness where Voss had been, and then he looked at her, and she could see in his face something that was neither relief nor pride, but shared something with both the expression of a man looking at something he hadn't fully understood. He had until the moment he came close to losing it. "Margaret," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say." He looked at her. "Do you? You're going to say that you should have been at the barn and not on the ridge, and that you should have anticipated Voss splitting from the group." A pause. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked up at him. "I was going to say," he said, "that I've been on this mountain for 11 years, and I've never once had someone watch the east approach and coordinate the north position and cut off the lateral move to the barn all at the same time." He held her gaze. "I was going to say that I couldn't have held this ranch tonight alone." She looked at him for a long moment. The mountain was quiet now, the specific settled quiet that comes after rather than before. Ruth's voice came from the east porch calling out that the approach was clear, her tone carrying the flat satisfaction of a woman who has handled her business. "We should go check on Ruth," Margaret said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she said, "Nate, after this is over, when Cole comes and the claim is settled and Calloway is finished, I need you to tell me something honestly. All right? Do you want this to be a real marriage?" She held his gaze the way he always held hers, directly, without flinching, giving him the full weight of the question. Not practical, not an arrangement. Real. He was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. Not too quick, not a social answer. The actual time a man takes to examine himself honestly before he speaks. "I've wanted that," he said, "since the morning you told me not to thank you for biscuits, because it was a very low bar." He paused. "I didn't think I had the right to say so." "Why not?" "Because you came here running from something," he said. "And I didn't want you to stay here because you were still afraid. I wanted you to stay." He stopped. "I wanted it to be your choice. Freely made." She looked at him. This man who explained himself to frightened cats. Who checked whether she nodded before he reached for her father's ledgers. Who built a plan and told her the difficult parts when she asked, and gave her a position on the North Ridge, because she'd earned it, and came around the barn corner at a run when he thought she might be hurt. "It's freely made," she said. "Completely." Something broke open in his face. Then, not dramatically, nothing in Nathaniel Granger was ever dramatic, but the particular set of restraint he'd been maintaining since the first morning cracked, and underneath it was something direct and warm and entirely real. He took her face in both hands, careful the way he was with everything valuable, and he kissed her the way a man kisses someone he has been very patient with himself about wanting to kiss. And she kissed him back with the full truth of 5 weeks of paying careful attention to who he was. Ruth Calver's voice came from the east porch. I don't know what's happening around that corner, and I'm choosing not to investigate. But whenever you two are ready, I'd very much appreciate some of that coffee I can smell from here." Margaret laughed against Nate's mouth. He pulled back and looked at her, and what was on his face was new, open in a way she hadn't seen before, the door fully off the frame, and it made him look younger and more like himself at the same time. "Coming, Ruth," he said loud enough to Carrie. "Take your time," Ruth said. "I'm old, not blind." They went inside. Margaret made coffee and Ruth sat at the table with her Winchester propped against the wall, and she talked in the direct, economical way of a woman who doesn't waste words about what she'd seen on the East Approach. 4 men, 2 of whom she'd recognized as Calloway's regular hired labor from when they'd worked the stockyards south of Silver Ridge, which meant Calloway had pulled his local network in, which meant he was running low on outside resources, which meant he was closer to the end of his operational capacity than he might appear. "He's burning through capital," Ruth said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "Men like Voss don't come cheap. Local men he can threaten or charm into service, but the Voss type, those are expensive. He can't keep that up indefinitely. He only needs to last until he can move the land filing through before coal arrives," Nate said. "He can't move it now," Margaret said. Both of them looked at her. "The contest filing is on record in Silver Ridge. Pierce would have to demonstrate the contest is invalid before the survey can proceed, and he can't do that without a hearing, and he can't schedule a hearing before Cole arrives with the documentation." She looked at her coffee. "Calloway is out of legal moves. What happened tonight was because he's out of legal moves." Ruth looked at her with the sharp-eyed approval of a woman who respects precision. "How do you know so much about this?" she said, not challenging, genuinely curious. "My father kept the books," Margaret said. "I kept them with him, and then I kept them for Calloway's case against us in my head because there was nothing else to keep them in." She paused. "Legal process runs on records. If you understand the records, you understand where the pressure points are." Ruth looked at Nate. "Where did you find her?" "My chicken coop," Nate said. Ruth looked at Margaret. Margaret shrugged. "It's true," she said. Ruth smiled the first full smile Margaret had seen from her, and it was a good one, broad and real and entirely unguarded. "Well," she said, "the mountain has better judgment than most people give it credit for." The rest of the night passed without incident, though none of them slept much. They kept watch in rotation, the 3 of them, and when the gray dawn finally came up over the peaks, Margaret was at the North Ridge, and she watched it come, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. Rightness. The specific sensation of being exactly where you are supposed to be. She was still on the ridge when she heard the horses below, and her hand went to the rifle before she'd consciously decided to reach for it. And then she made out the shapes. Not 5 men coming up with flat-eyed intent, but 4 riders in a deliberate formation, 2 wearing federal badges visible even from this distance. And beside them, on a gray horse that was moving faster than it looked, Frank Garrett. She was on her feet. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She went down the ridge at a pace that was almost a run, and she came around the barn to the front gate as Nate was coming out of the house, and they reached the gate at the same moment and looked at each other, and she saw on his face exactly what she felt. It was almost over. Garrett pulled up first and looked at them both, and he looked tired from the hard riding and deeply profoundly satisfied in the way of a man who has waited a long time for the right moment. "Cole's 2 days behind me," he said, "but he sent these ahead." He gestured to the 2 deputies. "They have everything they need to serve notice on Pierce and freeze the BlackRock filing." "Voss," Nate said. "Voss and his men were picked up on the trail 2 miles down," one of the deputies said. He was older, weathered with the no-nonsense manner of a federal officer who has seen enough of the territory to be unsurprisable. "Garrett identified them coming down. We detained them for questioning." He looked at Nate. "You want to tell me what happened on this mountain last night?" Nate told him, concisely in the order it happened. The deputy listened and wrote in a small notebook with the methodical patience of a man who is building a record, and Margaret understood watching him write that every word Nate said was becoming part of something official and documented and real. No more carrying things unsupported. No more being the only witness to your own truth. When Nate finished, the deputy looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Granger, you confronted Voss directly at the barn." "I did," she said. "He left voluntarily." "He made a rational decision," she said. "I gave him the facts, and he acted on them." The deputy looked at her for a moment with an expression she thought might in a weathered federal officer constitute being impressed. He wrote something in his notebook. "We'll need a formal statement from you when Marshal Cole arrives." "I'll have it ready," she said. "Written out clearly, with dates." He nodded once, closed his notebook, looked at the property around him. The barn, the house, the garden visible past the east fence, the mountain rising behind it all. "Nice piece of land," he said. "It is," Nate said. "Shame about that survey marker on the North Range," the deputy said. He reached into his coat and produced a document. "Consider it officially invalid. Cole's order effective as of this morning." He handed the document to Nate. Nate read it, handed it to Margaret. She read it and felt it go through her in a wave that was not triumph too clean for triumph too quiet, but something very like completion. The specific feeling of a circle closing. She handed it back to Nate. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket against his chest, where the marriage license had been on the morning they rode down to Silver Ridge. "Frank," Nate said, looking at Garrett. "You made it." "Told you I ride fast," Garrett said. He looked at Margaret with those eyes that had filled with something in his kitchen when she'd laid out the ledgers, the grief and relief look of a man whose truth had finally been received. "Your father's records held up to everything Cole's office checked them against," he said. "Every entry, every date. The cashier's receipt, Cole said it was the piece that made it all fit together. Without that receipt, they had a story. With it, they have a pattern." She looked at the old man on his gray horse. "Thank you for riding," she said. "Thank your father for keeping good books," he said. "I just carried them." Ruth Calver appeared from around the east corner of the house, with her Winchester and her sharp eyes, and her general air of having handled her portion of the proceedings competently, and she looked at the deputies, and at Garrett, and at the document in Nate's coat pocket and said, "Is it done?" "Not quite," Nate said. "Cole needs to get here. Pierce and Calloway need to be formally charged. There'll be hearings." "But the land?" Ruth said. "The land is ours," Margaret said. Ruth looked at her, gave a single crisp nod. "Good," she said. "Then I'm going to go home and sleep." She looked at the deputy. "You'll want my statement too, I imagine?" "Yes, ma'am," the deputy said. "Tomorrow," she said, "after I've slept." She looked at Margaret, and something in her face was different from the sharp evaluation of their first meeting warmer, now the look of a woman who has decided someone is worth knowing fully. "Come down to the boarding house when this settles," she said. "I want to hear the whole story, from the beginning." "There are chickens involved at the beginning," Margaret said. "Even better," Ruth said, and rode off down the mountain. Garrett stayed for coffee and breakfast. Margaret made it without thinking, the reflex of a woman who feeds people, because feeding people is one of the ways she shows that they matter, and he ate and talked with the deputies and Nate about the formal process ahead, and she listened and contributed when she knew something useful and was quiet when she didn't, and the whole of it felt in its particular ordinary functional way, like the first morning of something rather than the last night of something else. When Garrett and the deputies rode down to Silver Ridge to begin serving the formal notices, the ranch was quiet. Just the two of them, and Ada nickering in the pasture, and the barn cat sitting on the porch railing in the early sun with her eyes half closed. Margaret was washing the breakfast dishes when Nate came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She could feel him there without looking. "It's going to take time," he said. "The hearings. Calloway will fight it." "He'll lose," she said. "Yes." A pause. "But it'll take time." "I know." She set a cup in the drying rack. "I'm not in a hurry." She felt him cross the kitchen and come to stand beside her at the basin, and he picked up the drying cloth and dried the cup she'd just washed without being asked, the way she'd fixed the cellar latch without being asked, because it was a task in front of him, and that was the kind of man he was, They washed and dried the breakfast dishes side by side in the morning quiet, and she thought about what Ruth had said. The mountain has better judgment than most people give it credit for. She had come off this mountain starving and terrified, with nothing but a brown dress and her father's truth sewn into its hem. She had come to this kitchen and eaten stew and been offered a choice. And she had made the choice freely, and it had turned out to be the right one. And she understood now, washing dishes in the morning light, that the right choice and the easy choice were rarely the same thing, and you couldn't always know which was which until you'd lived far enough into it to see what it became. She had lived far enough in. She knew. "Nate," she said. When Cole gets here and the hearings are scheduled, I want to open the bakery. Ruth mentioned the building next to the boarding house has been empty for 2 years. She handed him the last cup. My mother's recipes, my father's name. She looked at him. Here, on this mountain. He dried the cup, set it down, looked at her. I think, he said, that Silver Ridge has been waiting for that longer than either of us knows. She smiled. It was the full, unguarded kind that she'd almost forgotten she was capable of, the kind that had been buried under a year of her father's death and Calloway's threats and 4 days on a mountain with nowhere to go. It came back now like something that had been kept somewhere safe and was being returned. Good, she said. Then it settled. Outside the mountain, morning was doing what it always did at this hour, opening up wide and clear with the particular generosity of a place that doesn't concern itself with whether you've earned the view. It offered the same sky to the defeated as to the victorious, the same peaks and the same air and the same light coming hard and gold over the eastern ridge. Margaret Granger stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at it, and she knew with the same certainty she'd applied to her father's ledgers and to Voss's retreating footsteps and to the feeling of Nate's hands on her face in the dark outside the barn that she had finally and completely stopped running. She was home, and the hardest part was over. But what was coming next? What Marshall Cole would find when he rode up that mountain, what Calloway would say when the evidence was laid before him, and what truth would surface that none of them had yet accounted for, that was something no one on the ranch that morning was prepared for. Marshall Asa Cole rode up the mountain 2 days later, and he was nothing like Margaret had imagined. She'd built a picture of him from Nate's description, a straight man, a methodical man, and she'd filled in the rest from her experience of official men, which was limited and not flattering. She'd expected someone with the formal bearing of authority, someone who arrived with the weight of the law visible in his posture and his tone. What rode through the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning was a lean, quiet man in his 50s, with a weathered face and a rifle she never saw him touch, and eyes that moved through a room the way water moves through a landscape, finding every low point without being directed to it. He shook Nate's hand. He took off his hat when he came inside. He looked at Margaret and said, "Mrs. Granger, I've read your statement 3 times. I want to talk to you directly about the cashier's receipt before we go any further." She put coffee in front of him and sat down, and they talked for 45 minutes, and he asked questions that were precise enough that she understood he already knew most of the answers and was checking her account against what he'd established independently. She answered everything exactly as it was, including the parts that made her look uncertain or afraid, because she'd learned from her father that the value of a true record is that it doesn't require management. When she finished, Cole looked at his coffee, then at her. "Your father's ledger is the clearest financial record I've seen produced as evidence in 14 years of federal service," he said. "The man kept his books like he expected them to matter someday." "He kept them like they were his word," she said. "He thought they were the same thing." Cole nodded once. The way he nodded told her he was a man who understood that distinction and found it valuable. "Here's what you need to know," he said. "Calloway was arrested in Billings yesterday morning. My office moved on him the moment we had the cashier's receipt verified. Edford, the cashier, gave a full statement within 2 hours of being taken in. He'd been keeping his own records." Cole looked at Nate. Edford kept records of every transaction he processed for Calloway, including the ones Calloway told him to falsify. He kept them because he said he always thought someone would eventually come asking. The kitchen was very quiet. "Why?" Margaret said. He said he wasn't a dishonest man, Cole said. He said Calloway convinced him the first one was a technicality. By the time he understood what he was part of, he was too far in to walk away. So he kept records of everything his own insurance. Cole paused. His records match yours in every particular. Date, amount, terms, payment. They corroborate every entry in your father's ledger. She felt it hit her somewhere below the sternum. Not surprised she'd known her father's books were accurate, but the particular sensation of being believed, of the truth being established by someone with the authority to make it official, of her father's careful handwriting finally being seen by someone who could do something about it. Judge Presley, Nate said, resigned this morning, Cole said. Before we got to him. Which tells us he knew we were coming, which tells us someone in my office talked, which is a problem I am handling separately. His voice on that last phrase had a quality that Margaret thought would be very uncomfortable to be the subject of. His resignation doesn't protect him. We have 6 signed documents with his name on them that are provably fraudulent. He'll face charges. BlackRock, Margaret said. The principals are being identified, Cole said. It's a corporation with layers, that's how they built it to make the trail long. But Edford's records show the financial connection directly. It'll take time to prosecute fully, but the filing on your land, he looked at Nate, is dead. It was invalid the moment we established the fraud. Your contest stands. The North Range stays yours. He paused. All of it. Nate sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the marshal and didn't say anything for a moment. She'd learned by now that his silences were not empty, they were the sound of him processing something fully, rather than responding to the surface of it. The 3 other ranches, he said. South of here. That BlackRock moved against. Part of the investigation, Cole said. Some of those transactions may be reversible. I can't make promises, but it's being looked at. Frank Garrett's situation. Garrett's been cooperative, and his documentation is part of the record. Cole allowed something that was almost a smile. He's also extremely persistent. He came to my office in Helena and explained his grievance for an hour and a half. I took notes. That sounds like Frank, Nate said. I want to take your formal statement this afternoon, Cole said, looking at Nate. And then I'll need Mrs. Granger's sworn statement before I leave tomorrow morning. He looked at Margaret. Everything you've told me today, I need it in writing, signed with the specific dates you remember. I have it already written, she said. She'd done it the previous evening by lamplight, 5 pages in the clear hand her father had insisted on, with every date she could verify, and every date she'd estimated marked clearly as an estimate because honest records didn't exaggerate their own certainty. She went to the supply shelf and came back and put the pages in front of Cole. He looked at them. Read the first page with the focused attention he gave everything. Looked up. You wrote this last night. I had time to think on the ridge the night before, she said. I organized it then. Writing it out was fast. Cole looked at the pages again. I'm going to need to keep these. I made a copy, she said. For our records. He looked at her with those water-finding eyes. Mrs. Granger, he said, you are either a naturally gifted legal witness, or you've been preparing for this your whole life. My father kept honest books, she said. I suppose I learned what that looks like. Cole took his statement from Nate that afternoon on the porch, while Margaret baked. She baked when she needed to think. Had always been that way. The rhythm of it organized her mind, and she could hear their voices through the window, the low back and forth of 2 serious men constructing an accurate record of events. She made bread, and she made a berry pie from the last of the summer fruit she'd put up. And she thought about her father in his bakery at dawn with the ovens going, and the whole day ahead of him, and every penny he'd ever owed, accounted for, in his careful hand. She thought they have him now, Papa. They have Calloway and Edford and Presley, and the documents and the receipts and your ledgers with your handwriting in them, and it is going to hold. It is going to hold. She pulled the bread from the oven, and she was crying, which surprised her because she'd thought she was past the crying part. But she supposed the crying part didn't end just because the danger did. Some things waited until you were safe enough to feel them fully. She wiped her face on her apron and cut the bread and brought it out to the porch. Cole looked up from his notes, looked at the bread, looked at her face and the apron, and had the decency to say nothing about either. He took the bread and said thank you in the manner of a man who means it simply, and Nate looked at her with the particular private look she'd been learning to read, the one that said more than he was going to put into words in present company. And she looked back at him, and that was enough. Cole left the next morning. He shook Nate's hand at the gate and looked at Margaret and said, "You'll hear from my office within 3 weeks on the formal resolution of the land claim. The criminal proceedings will take longer, but your piece of it." He stopped. "Your father did good work," he said. "It held up to everything." She nodded. Her throat was doing something inconvenient. "Thank you, Marshall." "Thank your father," he said, which was almost exactly what Garrett had said, and she thought there was something fitting in that two separate men who had examined her father's work and arrived at the same conclusion independently, which was what honest records did. They confirmed themselves. Cole rode down the mountain, and she watched him go, and then she turned back to the ranch and looked at it, really looked at it the way you look at something once the emergency is over and you have the space to see what you've actually been protecting. The garden she'd expanded was still producing the late-season things. The barn was solid. The fence posts Nate had replaced after Voss's men burned them were fresh and straight. The kitchen window had morning light coming through it at an angle that fell directly on the table where her father's ledgers had lain the night she'd put them down for the first time in someone else's keeping. She had made this place, not built it. Nate had built it 11 years of his hands in every board and fence line and water channel. But she had made it a home in the way that was different from a building, and she knew it, and she found she had no interest in being modest about it. It had taken real work, the kind that showed. "What are you thinking?" Nate said. He'd come to stand beside her. "I'm thinking I need to go see Ruth about that building next to the boarding house," she said. He looked at her. "Now. The hearings will take months," she said. "I can't spend months waiting. I need to work." She looked at the mountain. "And Silver Ridge needs a bakery." He was quiet a moment. "I'll ride down with you." "I know you have fence to check on the east line." "The fence can wait an hour." She looked at him. "Nate, you don't have to come everywhere I go. I'm not going to break." "I know you're not going to break," he said. "I want to come." He paused. "If that's all right." She looked at him, this enormous, careful, quiet man who talked to barn cats and dried dishes without being asked, and had told her she didn't owe him anything on the second morning of their marriage, and had meant it every day since. "It's all right," she said. They rode down to Silver Ridge together, and the town had a different quality to it than it had on the morning they'd ridden down to file the contest. Word had traveled, it always did, and faster than geography should allow, and she felt it in the way people looked up when they came through. Not the curious appraisal of strangers. Something warmer. The boy Billy was sweeping the walk outside the general store, and he looked at Nate with his usual awe, and then at Margaret with an expression that was working toward respect, and had most of the distance covered. Ruth Calver was behind the counter of her boarding house when they walked in, and she looked at their faces and correctly read the overall situation. "It's done," she said. "Cole took the statements," Nate said. "Calloway's in custody." Ruth put both hands flat on the counter and breathed out through her nose the breath of someone releasing something that has been held a very long time. "My brother," she said. "His documentation is part of the record," Margaret said. "Cole mentioned the earlier transactions are being reviewed." Ruth looked at the counter. Her jaw was working in the specific way of someone keeping a strong emotion in its proper container. Then she looked up, and the sharpness was back in her eyes, but it was a different quality of sharp, now cleaner somehow. "The building," she said. "You're still wanting it." "I'm wanting it," Margaret said. Ruth looked at Nate. "You're all right with this?" "It's her decision," Nate said. Ruth looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating something. Then she looked at Margaret. "The rent is reasonable and the oven in the back is sound. Previous tenant was a dressmaker. I don't know what a dressmaker needs with an oven, but she left it in good condition." She paused. "There's a broken window latch on the south side." "I'll fix it," Margaret said, with the same tone she'd used about the cellar latch. And Ruth Calver smiled that full, real broad smile that changed her face entirely. "Come look at it," Ruth said. The building was right where Ruth had described it, a solid structure that had been used and used well, and needed someone to use it again with purpose. Margaret walked through it, and pressed her hand against the back wall, and looked at the oven, and opened and closed the oven door, and thought about her mother standing at an oven in Billings, and her father in the front of the shop, writing an order in his clear, careful hand, and she thought here. This is where it continues. "I'll take it," she said. Ruth nodded. Nate, standing in the doorway of the building, said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he knew it. They rode home with the lease agreement in Margaret's coat pocket, and she felt it against her side the whole way up the mountain, small and significant, a paper that said, "Here is where you are. Here is what you're building. This is yours." The weeks that followed were the fullest she'd known. She split her time between the ranch and the building in Silver Ridge, which she cleaned and organized and equipped with the methodical pleasure of someone who knows exactly what a kitchen needs to function and has been given the opportunity to build one correctly from the beginning. Nate came down 3 times with the wagon and helped her move the heavy things without commenting on the weight or the logistics or anything except the practical questions of where she wanted them. The morning she lit the oven for the first time in what would become the Dawson Bakery, she'd decided on her father's name because it was his recipes and his reputation for honesty that were the foundation of everything. She stood in front of it and felt the heat come out and smelled the particular smell of a working oven that takes something raw and makes it ready, and she thought she'd never in her life felt more precisely like herself. Ruth was her first customer. She came in before the bread was fully cool and bought 2 loaves and a pie and stood at the counter and looked around the room and said, "Your father would have approved of this." "Did you know him?" Margaret said, surprised. "Not personally, but Billings isn't so far that reputation doesn't travel." Ruth picked up the loaves. People spoke well of him, said he was the kind of man who charged a fair price and never shorted a measure. She looked at Margaret. "That's the whole of what matters in this business." "That's the whole of what matters in most business," Margaret said. Ruth smiled and went out, and Margaret turned back to her oven and started the next batch. The word spread the way. Word spreads in frontier towns fast and completely carried in the specific personal way that puts a face and a story on a place rather than just a product. By the end of the first week, travelers coming through Silver Ridge were stopping not just for the bread, but to see the woman they'd been hearing about. The bakery was open 6 days, and by the end of the first month, it was doing enough business that Margaret had hired the young woman who worked mornings at the general store to come in afternoons and help with the production. The girl's name was Clara 17, with quick hands and an eagerness to learn that Margaret recognized, because she'd been exactly that girl in her father's shop at the same age. She taught Clara the way her father had taught her. Every step explained every reason given, no mystery kept for the sake of the keeper's authority. A baker who teaches well, her father had said, builds something that lasts past herself. The hearings began in the second month in Silver Ridge's small courthouse, with a federal judge brought in from Helena who had no connection to Presley and no financial relationship with BlackRock Capital. And Cole had been thorough enough in vetting the judicial appointment that everyone in the room knew it. Calloway was brought in from Billings in federal custody. She saw him for the first time since the morning after her father's burial, sitting across the courtroom in his good suit with a lawyer beside him who was trying to project confidence and mostly projecting the particular attentive anxiety of a man whose case was not going well. Calloway looked at her when she came in. She looked back. She didn't look away, and she didn't flinch, and she didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, the cold clutch of fear that had lived in her chest since the morning he'd walked into her father's bakery with forged papers and a smile. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable. She looked at him, and she saw a man who had calculated that her father's death was an opportunity and had been wrong about that calculation in a way that was about to be made permanently official. She sat in the witness chair, and she gave her testimony in the clear, organized sequence she'd been preparing since the night on the North Ridge, and she answered every question she was asked, and several that weren't asked, but should have been. And Cole's attorney told her afterward that she was the best witness he'd seen in a Montana Territory proceeding in 10 years. "I had good preparation," she said. "What kind of preparation?" "A father who kept honest books," she said. "And a few weeks on a mountain that needed defending." Calloway's attorney tried 3 different approaches to challenge the ledger's authenticity, and Cole's team answered each one with Edford's corroborating records and the cashier's receipt, and Margaret's sworn testimony, and Frank Garrett's written account, and Ruth's brother's letters from Miles City. And on the 3rd attempt, the attorney sat down and didn't try a 4th. The pattern was too complete. You couldn't argue with a pattern that closed on itself from multiple independent directions. Nate sat behind her in the courtroom through all 3 days of the proceeding. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and he didn't interrupt, and he didn't try to manage anything that was hers to manage. He was simply there, solidly, reliably, completely there. The way the mountain was there at the back of the ranch, and she found it those 3 days more sustaining than she would have known how to explain. On the 3rd day, when the judge had heard the full record and the attorneys had made their final arguments, he looked over his glasses at the room in the particular way of a judge who has been doing this long enough to know what a decisive case looks like and find the clear ones almost restful. He said the ruling would take 30 days. He said the evidence as presented was, and he chose his words with judicial precision, compelling and substantially corroborated. Calloway looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. 30 days later, the ruling came by wire to Silver Ridge, and the telegraph operator rode it up the mountain himself, because he'd decided it warranted the personal delivery, and Margaret read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and Nate reading it over her shoulder. Silas Calloway, guilty of fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud and wrongful interference with federal property proceedings. Sentenced to 7 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. His assets, including all financial instruments connected to the fraudulent debt claims, dissolved and voided. Gerald Thomas Dawson debt declared fraudulent in full. Estate cleared. Record amended. Record. Nathaniel Granger homestead claim confirmed in full, including North Range water rights. Contest resolved in favor of the claimant. She read her father's name 3 times. The debt declared fraudulent in full. She thought about him getting up before dawn and firing the ovens and writing in his ledger with his careful hand, paying every penny he owed because it was the right thing to do, never knowing that a man was already planning to say he hadn't. She thought about how he'd died, not knowing that part of his story, the being accused part. And she was glad, actually, that he hadn't known. He'd died knowing what he was. He hadn't needed to defend it. But it was defended now, officially, in a federal record that would outlast all of them. She folded the paper and set it down, and the telegraph operator, who was a decent man named Webb, who had been watching her read with appropriate discretion, said, "Good news, Mrs. Granger." "The best kind," she said. "The kind that was already true. It just needed to be written down." Webb rode back down the mountain with 2 loaves of bread she pressed on him over his protests, and she turned from the gate and looked at Nate, and he was looking at her with that expression she'd finally found a name for some time in the 2nd month of their marriage. It wasn't quite pride that implied a distance between them that no longer existed. It was the expression of a man who has seen someone he loves do something exactly as well as he always knew they could, and who finds that the knowing it in advance doesn't reduce the satisfaction of watching it happen. "Nate," she said. "I need to go tell Clara that the morning production needs to be doubled. We're going to be busy today." He looked at her. "People are going to come up here." "People are going to come to the bakery in Silver Ridge," she said. "And some of them will come up here too, and I intend to feed all of them." He looked at the mountain, at the ranch, at the garden that was still producing even as the season turned because she'd extended it properly and timed the plantings with the mountain's particular growing calendar, which she'd learned from Nate and from the land itself over the months of paying attention. "We should build a bigger table," he said. She stopped, looked at him. He said it the way he said things, plainly, practically, as though it were the obvious next step. "A bigger table," she repeated. "Sundays," he said. "Ruth mentioned people have been looking for somewhere to gather. Community sort of thing. Silver Ridge doesn't have a proper—" He paused. "You'd be good at that. The gathering part." She looked at him for a long time. This man who had offered her eggs and a choice, and had kept every word of every condition she'd named, and had never once made her feel she was there because she owed him something. This man who dried dishes and talked to barn cats and stood behind her in a courtroom for 3 days because she needed him there, and he understood that needing and giving were not the same as owing. "You want Sunday dinners?" she said. "I want a bigger table," he said. "What you do with it is your business." She took his face in her hands, the way he'd taken hers outside the barn, careful and deliberate, and she looked at him. "You are," she said, "the strangest and best thing that ever came out of a chicken coop situation." The corner of his mouth moved. "I wasn't the one in the chicken coop. Technicality," she said, and kissed him in the morning light with the mountain behind them, and the ruling in her pocket, and her father's name cleared, and the oven in Silver Ridge still warm from the first batch of the day. The Sunday gatherings started 3 weeks later and grew faster than either of them had anticipated, which was perhaps predictable in hindsight, given what she'd learned about frontier people and their hunger for something that felt like community. Ruth came every week without fail, and brought her opinions and her Winchester. The Winchester stayed outside, but the opinions arrived fully loaded, and Margaret found she was grateful for both. Frank Garrett came down from his place most Sundays, a little less angry each time, which she thought was probably as close to healed as a man like Frank was going to get, and she respected the pace of it. Clara brought her younger brother sometimes, a 12-year-old who had apparently decided Nate was the most interesting man he'd ever encountered, and who spent most of each Sunday following him around the property, receiving education about cattle and fence work and mountain weather patterns that Nate delivered with the same patient seriousness he gave everything. Billy the sweeping boy came 3 Sundays in a row before his father came with him on the 4th, and the father was a man named Horace, who'd farmed south of town for years in the particular quiet of a man who has not had a reason to come up a mountain, and has now apparently found one. Horace's wife came the 5th Sunday. She brought a dish. She sat at the table Margaret had built with Nate's help, a proper wide farmhouse table that fit 12 if they weren't shy about elbows, and she looked around at the people gathered and said, "This is what I've been wanting since we came to this territory." Margaret said, "Then you should have come sooner." Horace's wife said, "I didn't know where to go." "You know now," Margaret said. Deputy Stroud came once. He rode up the mountain on a Sunday in the 4th month, and he sat at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has something to account for and isn't sure of his welcome. Margaret saw him from the kitchen, and she watched him for a moment, and then she brought him coffee and sat down next to him. "I didn't know the route Voss used," Stroud said without preamble, looking at the coffee. "I reported what I saw on the property visit as part of my official notes. I didn't know those notes were being passed on." "Did you suspect?" she said. He was quiet a moment. "I suspected that some things weren't right," he said. "I didn't do enough about that suspicion." She looked at him. He was young, and he was being honest about a thing that was uncomfortable to be honest about, and it cost him something to be here, and he'd come anyway. "Did you tell Cole?" she said. "Everything," he said. "He's investigating how the notes were accessed. I gave him my full account." She nodded. "Drink your coffee," she said, "and come back next Sunday. You look like a man who's been eating alone for too long." He looked up at her with an expression that was almost painfully grateful. "Mrs. Granger." "Margaret," she said. "We're not that formal up here." He came back the next Sunday. He became a regular. He was, she discovered, a decent man who had been in a situation with insufficient moral courage and had been trying to rebuild that courage since, which was the ordinary human condition in her experience, and she found she had no interest in withholding the table from ordinary human conditions. 5 months after Cole's deputies had ridden up the trail, the valley below the mountain had a name for her. She heard it first from Clara, who reported it with the slightly awestruck air of someone relaying something she thought was important. "They're calling you the Mountain Wife," Clara said. Margaret looked up from the dough she was folding. "Who is baby? People in Silver Ridge. Travelers. People who come through. Clara looked at her carefully. Not because you married a mountain man. I know, Margaret said. They say it because... Clara stopped finding her way to the right words with the conscientiousness of someone who wants to be accurate. Because of how you stood on the mountain, during everything. She paused. Because you didn't leave. Margaret looked at the dough in her hands. She thought about the North Ridge in the dark. She thought about Voss in the brush by the barn, and the shot she'd fired into the sky, and the precise factual way she'd told him the thing she'd told him. I stopped running. This is where I stopped. She thought about her father's ledgers on the kitchen table, and Cole's water-finding eyes, reading the receipt her father had kept because honest records were a form of respect. She thought about a woman who had come off 4 days of mountain in a brown dress with egg on her hands, and a man who had not shot her. It's a generous name, she said. It fits, Clara said. Margaret put the dough in the pan and didn't argue with her. On a Sunday in late November, after the first real snow had come, and the mountain had put on its winter face, and the table inside the ranch house was set for 14. Nate came inside from the morning chores and stopped in the kitchen doorway, the way he'd stopped that first morning when she'd made biscuits. He had the same look on his face, that slightly baffled, wholly genuine expression of a man who keeps encountering something he hadn't known to expect. What, she said. The Holloways are coming up from the South Road, he said. And I think I saw the Brennan family behind them. There won't be enough. I made extra, she said. He looked at her. How did you know? I didn't know, she said. I just always make extra. She handed him the bread basket and pointed him toward the table. Set it out. People are coming. He took the basket, and he looked at her standing at the stove in his kitchen. In their kitchen, in the kitchen of the ranch he'd built, and she'd made into a home, and she was already turning back to the stove because there were people coming, and she was going to feed them. And he thought about what he'd said to himself the morning he found her in the chicken coop, one hungry stranger. He'd thought he was solving a problem. He'd had absolutely no idea what was actually beginning. People came through the door in 2s and 3s, stamping snow off their boots, filling the house with the warmth of bodies and voices, and the particular Sunday quality that she'd been building 1 week at a time until it had become what it was. A real thing. A thing that existed independently, that would have kept going, even if she'd stepped back from it, because she'd built it on the same principle her father had built his ledgers on. Honesty, repeated consistently, eventually becomes something that sustains itself. Ruth sat at her usual place and gave her usual opinions, and Garrett ate 3 servings of the beef stew and didn't comment on it, and Clara helped pass dishes, and little Billy's father, Horace, carved the roast with the focused solemnity of a man who takes the honor seriously. And outside, the snow came down on Nate Granger's mountain in the quiet covering way of snow that intends to stay. After dinner, after the dishes were done, and the last family had ridden down the mountain trail after Ruth had left with her characteristic efficiency, and Garrett had gone with the particular satisfied heaviness of a well-fed man who'd had someone to talk to, Nate came out onto the porch and found Margaret there. She was looking at the valley below. The snow had stopped, and the moon was up, and the valley was white and still, and the mountain above them was dark and immovable, and the whole of it was so precisely completely beautiful that she hadn't been able to make herself go inside yet. She heard him come out, felt him stand beside her. 14 people, he said. 15, she said. Clara's brother stayed longer than the rest. He's still in the barn, you know that. I know, he said, the edge of something warm in his voice. He wants to know about the east fence repair process. Nate, she said. Do you remember what you said to me that first morning? She didn't look at him. About why you offered me the choice. I said you held your ground even when you expected to be shot, he said without needing to think about it. And that a person who's used to being treated badly learning to expect it doesn't mean they deserve it. Yes, she said. She was quiet a moment looking at the valley. I've been thinking about that. And you were right about the expecting part, she said. I had spent so long being treated like I was... She paused, found the word. Provisional. Like my place in any room was dependent on being useful enough, or small enough, or undemanding enough. She looked at the mountain. I didn't know that wasn't how it had to be until someone showed me it didn't have to be. He was quiet beside her. You gave me that, she said, the first morning. You put coffee on the table and you waited for me to sit down before you sat down, and you listened to my conditions like they were reasonable, which they were, but I hadn't been certain anyone would find them reasonable. She turned and looked at him. That's what you gave me, before any of the rest of it, before the mountain and the hearings and the bakery and all of it. She held his gaze. You gave me back the understanding that I was allowed to take up space. Nate Granger looked at his wife in the moonlight on the porch of the ranch he'd spent 11 years building alone, and he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant something was being turned over and examined, and he was going to say it exactly right. When I caught you stealing those eggs, he said, I thought I was saving one hungry stranger. She waited. The truth is, he said, you rescued this mountain long before I rescued you. She looked at him. She felt it go all the way down. Not the words, though the words were true, but the understanding behind them, the particular knowledge that she had been seen. Fully. From the beginning. By a man who didn't need her to be smaller, or quieter, or more convenient, who had handed her a rifle and a position on the North Ridge, and trusted her to hold it. Who had said, whatever you do with the table is your business, because he understood the difference between sharing a life and managing one. Her eyes were doing the inconvenient thing again. She let them. You're going to take credit for the mountain, she said. I'm giving you credit for the mountain, he said. The mountain was here before both of us. It was, he agreed. We just had to be worth it. She took his hand in both of hers, the same hand that had pressed briefly on her shoulder the night Voss came, and the same hand that had carried her father's ledgers, with careful, deliberate respect, and she held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. Nate, she said. Margaret. We are, she said. He looked at her. That expression, the one she'd been learning since the first morning, the one that lived between almost humor and almost tenderness, and was entirely and specifically, Nathaniel Granger was fully open now, nothing held back. And she looked at it, and she knew it, and she was known in return completely, which was the thing she had not known to call what she was looking for until she'd found it. The mountain stood behind them in the dark, immovable and patient, the way mountains are. The valley below was white and still. The ranch was quiet. Somewhere in the barn, a 12-year-old boy was still asking questions about east fence repairs, and a man who had been alone for 11 years was answering every single one of them. Inside on the kitchen shelf, the copy of her father's ledger sat beside the formal ruling from Cole's Court and the lease for the Dawson Bakery and the marriage certificate from Aldrich's office in Silver Ridge, 4 documents that together told the true story of what had happened on this mountain. That honest work is not wasted, even when it seems to disappear that a patient man and a determined woman are harder to defeat than anyone who underestimates. Either of them will ever understand, and that love, the real kind, the durable kind, is not built from beauty or perfection or a grand beginning. It is built from 2 people who decide morning after morning to show up for each other with their whole honest selves and to trust that that is enough. It was enough. It had always been enough. And on that mountain, under that sky, with 14 guests fed and a table that would seat more next Sunday, and a bakery in Silver Ridge bearing her father's name, and a man beside her whose word was the truest thing she'd ever been given. Margaret Dawson. Granger was not a fugitive, not a debtor's daughter, not a woman who had been found starving in a stranger's chicken coop. She was the mountain wife. She had earned every syllable of it, and she was home.